Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Freya had drank far too much. Her spinning head was beginning to throb violently, with the ominous telltale suggestion that tomorrow she was going to seriously regret drinking too much alcohol, and would likely be nursing a hangover from hell. My God, how much had she actually had to drink? She had stopped counting after the third cocktail. The young man who was chatting her up, whose name she could not remember, had been ploughing her with even more alcohol. He'd said, "I think we need another, don't you?" and had promptly trotted off to the bar to furnish their glasses with yet more exotic cocktails that were so delicious Freya had been knocking them back as though she was drinking Coca-Cola, which had not been a very good idea. Her body was beginning to rebel against her very bad decision to drink so much. The red warning lights in her throat were on high alert. Another glorified cocktail lined with sugar, decorated with fruit and a fancy umbrella, would likely bring forward a tsunami of bitter bile, along with the contents of her entire stomach, all over the bar's swirling red, gold and turquoise carpet. She wouldn't stand the humiliation of that. She did have some pride, although it was fading fast, like the dye in a pair of cheap blue jeans. Mr. What's-his-name was waiting patiently in the long line at the bar to be attended to by the girl behind the bar, who was serving all the patrons diligently, with an exhausted smile upon her face. Thankfully there were lots of people, all requiring refills, like animals gathering around a watering hole in Africa. Mr. What's-his-name didn't seem to be remotely inebriated, but then, being well over 6 foot tall, he probably could handle his booze a lot better than Freya could, who at 5'5" was beginning to feel a lot like a drunken sailor. Now was her quintessential moment to escape, to get out of this stuffy bar, which seemed to be closing in on her on every side, so that she was beginning to feel like a spider caught up in a matchbox. She was overcome with a cloying sense of claustrophobia, and it felt as if her chest was tightening. She needed to get out of here as fast as she could, so that she could breathe in the fresh air from out of doors. She could hear the pinging of glasses, the rattling of ice tinkling in people's glasses, the rise and fall of people's animated voices. The man who'd been chatting her up in the bar all evening had been nice enough, of course, but she couldn't remember a single word he'd said. Her mind was otherwise engaged. She had been preoccupied with the very thought she'd come here to wipe away, like the raindrops on a car windscreen. And despite her very best efforts, those brooding thoughts seemed as resistant as chewing gum stuck under a classroom desk, because even a tranquilizing anaesthetic from a long succession of stiff drinks would not banish them. So much had gone awry this year, as her whole life had come tumbling down like a large pile of dominoes. First there had been her long-term boyfriend, Miles Tennyson, who had inadvertently taken her to one side, and in a stiff, emotionless voice he had said, "We need to talk." Freya had seen by his tight demeanour and the determined, almost severe expression in his cold eyes that what he needed to talk about was not going to be good. She had felt her heart banging violently in her chest, almost as if she could perceive what was coming, as if she could anticipate the sharp sting of his words. Miles had told her rather grimly, with an air of insouciance, "I'm sorry, Freya. There is someone else." "What?" gasped Freya, cupping her hands over her mouth in astonishment. "You've been cheating on me," she had asked. He shook his head furiously. "Of course I have not been cheating on you, Freya. But I'm in love with someone else, and so we're just not going to work out, are we? I have no idea whether this woman I like will reciprocate my interest in her. But don't you see, the very fact that I'm feeling this way means there really is no future for us. If I really were in love with you, Freya, I wouldn't be hankering after another woman, would I? And I assure you, this is not lust. It's far deeper than that. But I can't help the way I feel. This woman occupies my every thought. I just can't get her out of my mind. She's not even as pretty as you are, but in my opinion, she's perfect. You know we've always been completely honest with each other, Freya. I'm not going to tell you what you want me to say, just to spare your feelings. I'm sorry it has come to this. I do like you a lot. I always have, and I suppose I always will. But it won't work out between us long term." He had stared at her apologetically, and she was sure she'd seen pity in his eyes, as if quite suddenly he no longer found her remotely desirable, and was tossing her out as if she was a pile of second-hand clothes that were surplus to requirements that he no longer wanted or needed. Whoever this mystery woman was, Freya could tell Miles was unhealthily fixated upon her, and she privately hoped his wistful relationship with her would come crashing down like a large pile of kitchen plates and go badly wrong. Miles deserved that for breaking her heart like this, and being so ruthlessly cold-blooded and dispassionate about terminating their relationship, as if their 3-year relationship had meant nothing, and was as insignificant as terminating a gym membership. Freya had rarely been in love with Miles, and his callous, heartless words that rang in her head with the piercing intrusiveness of a seagull's screams completely knocked the wind out of her sails, and took her so off guard she didn't know quite how to react to the events that had just transpired, as she was numb with the shock. Later she would definitely regret walking away without lashing out at Miles significantly, by saying something as ruthlessly cutting to knock him off his inflated pedestal, but no words were forthcoming. Instead, she'd been so confounded and confused, and unable to say anything in response to his appalling cutthroat confessions. It had been so crushing. I mean, he hadn't even cheated on her, but in some ways it was worse than that. She felt as if she'd been sadistically slashed across the face, brutally with an ice pick, and the indelible scars she'd likely carry along with her future relationships, like unwelcome baggage, she could not relinquish. It would be difficult to trust another man again, after being so viciously spat out by Miles. She'd have expected to throw something at her boyfriend, scream at him, lash out at him with her sharp pink talons, like McCavity the family cat at her parents' home, who could give you a scratch you were unlikely to ever forget. But instead she meekly went to her bedroom that they'd shared together for the last 3 years, scrambled around awkwardly in her drawers and wardrobe to retrieve all her belongings. She felt like a kid at boarding school, having been expelled by a formidable headmistress, and now in shame she was forced to vacate the premises. She wore humiliation like a bag of shame on her lapel, like a black mark against her name. She hurriedly filled her suitcase with all her worldly possessions, throwing everything in with a whirlwind-like haste, because now that Miles wanted her out of his apartment and out of his life for good, she could not get away fast enough. She did have a smidgen of pride, even though it was as faint as a smudge of nude lipstick left on her lips. She was determined not to cry in front of Miles. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. She would not allow him to see how he had fiendishly torn her apart, like a child dismembering an insect, removing one leg at a time and then smashing it under a boot so that nothing was left of the thing. She would march away with dignity, even if it killed her, with her head held high, as if their relationship had meant nothing. She'd show him she didn't care a damn. She hoped that she'd make him sting a little. Miles had an ego on him the size of the Empire State Building. She'd like to bruise that ego a little, with a kick in the guts, by acting that she didn't give a damn. She heard Miles call an Uber taxi for her, giving her sister's address as the chosen destination for her to disembark, almost as if he was sending a pile of uncherished second-hand goods to the local charity shop for them to have to sort out. Miles, who lacked any remorse, had been heartily relieved to see her go, as if finally the exterminator had got rid of a very unfortunate rat problem in his apartment, and could breathe again, knowing that the cookies in the pantry were safe from being manhandled and ravenously devoured. Freya's heart was so grievously heavy, so broken. She was sure if she'd been plunged into a large body of water, she'd have likely sunk to the very bottom, like a large stone, never to reappear again. She had sat in the back of the taxi, and as the Uber taxi driver had driven away from the green leafy neighbourhood that had been her sanctuary for the last 3 years, the floodgates of her lugubrious tears had rolled down her cheeks like water from a cloud that had finally burst. "Are you all right, love?" asked the taxi driver kindly, his brown eyes filled with concern for her, as he studied his bedraggled passenger, that looked as forlorn as an abandoned kitten that you'd find on the side of the road, that was desperately in need of some tender loving care. This perfect stranger showed more concern for Freya than her boyfriend of 3 years had done. He pulled over to the side of the road, killed his engine, and turned around to look at her kindly. "What happened back there, if you don't mind my asking? You could have touched the tension with a knife. That man seemed eager to see the back of you." Freya looked at the taxi driver through the mist of her tears. "He dumped me," she said. "He dumped me," through her sobs. "We've been together for 3 years, and he told me he fancies somebody else and wants to pursue this woman he likes. She doesn't even know he likes her. So he's kicked me to the curb like an old shoe. He doesn't give a damn about me. He doesn't care about my feelings or what it feels like to be just tossed out of the house." "What a jerk," said the taxi driver, "throwing you out like that. As you say, like a piece of trash. That is a very unkind, insensitive thing to do. I'm sorry, love. Really I am. You deserve a whole lot better. On the bright side of things, if there is one, at least you know what a loser he really is. He shouldn't have treated a lady like that. There are kinder ways to end a relationship." "I hate him. I absolutely hate him," said Freya through her gritted teeth. "I hate him. I wish he was dead. How could he do this to me? He's got the emotional integrity of a crocodile." "I'm very sorry, love. I don't know what to say. Maybe in the circumstances you had a lucky escape. Personally, I didn't like the look of him at all. He was very aloof and dispassionate in the way he treated you back there. If I had a son who treated a lady like that, I'd have his guts for garters, and I mean that literally." Freya barely remembered that ominous drive to her sister's swanky ultra-modern home, as her recollections became very vague. In between her desperate sobs, the taxi driver had constantly reassured her. "You wait and see, my love. Everything will be just fine. In my experience, it always is. You will look back on this moment with gratitude one day, and you will say, 'Boy, I had a lucky escape back there. It could have been worse. I could have married the fellow.'" The taxi driver drew up outside Freya's sister's house, killed his engine, climbed out of the car, opened her passenger side door like a real gentleman, and proceeded to the trunk of the car to pull out her suitcase, which he handed over to her with a measure of reluctance. His brown eyes looked earnestly worried. "Are you sure you're going to be all right, love?" he'd asked her. "I don't like leaving you like this in such a state." "I'll be fine. Thank you so much. You've been very kind, very understanding," said Freya, biting her lips, feeling sure that she'd never ever be fine again. The taxi driver waited to see that Freya got safely inside her sister's house before he drove away, because unlike Miles, he was a gentleman. Freya had marched down the long stone pathway until she reached the grandiose front door of her sister's house, wheeling her suitcase steadily behind her. She had knocked at the door, and when Rainey had opened the door, her sister had frowned at her. Rainey's eyes skimmed the stuffed suitcase in Freya's hand, and the puffy puppy dog eyes staring up at her pleadingly, like a street dog, begging not to be turned away. "Oh, my word! Look what the cat dragged in! What are you doing on the front doorstep, Freya? You look dreadful," asked Rainey, staring down at her sister's suitcase, and then looking up towards the taxi and waving at the taxi driver with a nod of her head. Miles dumped me. He threw me out of the apartment. Please can I stay with you, Rainey? I've got nowhere else to go. I'm homeless." "Well, you'd better come in then, hadn't you?" said her sister stiffly. Rainey, her older sister, had never been desperately sympathetic towards Freya. She'd always been rather emotionally detached, and Freya knew she'd never be made to feel welcome in her sister's modern minimalistic home. She had stayed there once before, when her life was in tatters, and her sister and her punctilious husband Thornton were not exactly very chivalrous hosts. They had constantly asked her whether she'd found alternative accommodation, and likely now they would do much the same, always pressing Freya to leave before she got too comfortably settled into their pretentious home, that Freya had never liked because it lacked warmth. They'd watch Freya warily, like two restless cats on a hot tin roof, as if she was a kid that they were afraid would smear sticky jam over their pristine kitchen surfaces, or spill a carton of milk over their perfect marble flooring, or leave grubby handprints over the sparkling mirror and chocolate stains over their fine white cotton sheets. Maybe they were afraid she'd never leave their home. Like an unwelcome guest, she'd try to root herself in the corners of the ceiling, like a creeping ivy, rambunctiously worming its way into their lives. If the truth be told, Freya did not enjoy being in Rainey's house, any more than they enjoyed having her in their precious immaculate home, as a non-paying guest. Ostensibly they would be quick to remind her of this fact, and how much her stay was actually costing them. The couple were not warm at the very best of times, nor had they ever been sympathetic to the buoyant ups and downs in Freya's life. She was sure they thought she was flaky and naive, but they had never even bothered to get to know her properly. Rainey was 10 years older than Freya, so the age gap between the two of them was sizable. In truth, Freya privately gleamed that her sister and husband thought that they were so much cleverer than she was. That was the problem with academics, as far as Freya was concerned. If you weren't swimming at their academic frequency, then you were a lower form of pond life that just didn't belong, and they'd rather not be acquainted with. I mean, after all, Freya had worked in a department store for a living, but both Rainey and her husband Thornton worked for the university, and saw what Freya did for a living as both frivolous and significantly unimportant. They had an attitude of superiority, as if they somehow saw themselves as swimming above the hoi polloi in society, which in Freya's opinion was delusional, because regular folk could be so much more emotionally intelligent. Before long, Freya was sitting in Rainey's kitchen, that was as white and as cold as her sister, with gleaming surfaces and shining cookers that looked new and sparkling, like a show kitchen that had never been used before a day in its life. The truth was there was nothing domesticated about her sister Rainey, who didn't even know how to fry an egg, so the couple were always ordering take-out or buying pre-cooked dishes from the store and ready-prepared salads. There was nothing remotely cosy about their home, no warm artistic touches, no pretty plants basking happily in the windowsill with a tumble of pretty leaves, or friendly vases of flowers scattered liberally throughout the house. Instead, the decor was stiff, unimaginative, but extremely expensive. The couple didn't have any animals, as in their opinion, cats and dogs invited mess and molted hair all over their furnishings, and likewise they had no children, because as Rainey had put it, kids were a nightmare that leached your bank account like the hungry maggots on a piece of roadkill, and the couple loathed being taken advantage of or exploited, even by the possibility of their own children. "Well, Freya, I think you're going to have to tell me what all this is about. Why you're suddenly homeless," said Rainey, as she handed her sister a steamy cup of decaffeinated coffee, as God forbid Rainey would not allow caffeine to cross the threshold of her home, as if in some way she thought it might contaminate her brain cells and shrink them to the size of a pinhead, and she couldn't have that. Everything about Rainey was prudently sensible, right down to the ugly, very practical brogue she wore on her feet, that looked like something a Mother Superior would wear in a convent. "I told you," said Freya. "Miles threw me out of his apartment. He didn't cheat on me, but he told me he fancies another lady. He's fancied her for a long time. So he says there's no future for us. So he just tossed me out, as if I meant nothing to him. Can you believe that? I've got nowhere to go, Rainey. That's why I came here. I promise you I won't get in your way. I'll help out around the house as much as I can, until I get myself sorted out, and then I'll be out of your hair. I don't want to outstay my welcome." Rainey grimaced. "What is wrong with you, Freya? You're not a baby anymore, for God's sake. You're almost 35 years old. But your relationships with men are highly questionable. You're like a kid playing dress-up with her dolls. But this is real life we're talking about, Freya. This isn't a dress rehearsal. I remember last time, when Scott ditched you. Do you remember? You were homeless and desperate, completely dependent on me and Thornton to help you out of one pickle to the next. You were a complete mess, an emotional screw-up. I seem to remember it was 3 months before you actually finally chose to leave our home. I don't want that happening again. Do you understand, Freya? You know what Thornton's like. He'll do his nut if you stay with us for too long. You can't outstay your welcome here. I know you're my sister, Freya, and I do love you very much, but you need to learn to be financially independent for your own good. How's the job at the department store going, by the way? Are you managing to successfully save any money? Or are you spending it like water?" She narrowed her eyes as she scrutinized Freya suspiciously. Freya shifted rather uncomfortably in the stiff kitchen chair that was as hard as sitting on a bag of coat hangers. She tried to avoid her sister's steely, obtrusive gaze. She knew exactly what her sister would think, and that was what a sorry mess she'd made of her life. "I was laid off about 3 months ago," said Freya, wincing, like a dog that had suddenly injured its paw. "I've been relying on Miles. I thought we would be together forever. I thought he'd eventually ask me to marry him. My bank account is depleted. They were laying off a lot of people at the department store. It hasn't been doing a booming trade, you see. So they had to make some brutal cuts. I've spent most of my redundancy package already. I had some hectic bills I needed to pay. You know how it is. Everything just gets on top of you." Rainey thumped her fists on the table. She looked furious. "You haven't been working for 3 months, Freya. Are you kidding me? Are you joking? You've been relying on your boyfriend Miles to support you? He then tosses you to the curbside like a plastic bag in need of recycling. Honestly, look at you, Freya. You shouldn't be dependent on anybody else. You need to be more resourceful. You're a lost cause. I have in mind to drop you off at the rescue centre to join the other waifs and strays that are looking for new homes." For a moment, her sister's hardened gaze softened, as within their depths there just might be a speck of compassion. Rainey reached out to squeeze her sister's hands encouragingly. "Look, I don't want to jump down your throat, Freya. I'm not a miserable old cow, you know. I can see that you're very upset. Of course you can stay here, but I don't want it to be for too long. For your own good, of course. I need you to do your utmost to find a job, to get back on your feet. If you don't make a go of things, I'll buy you a one-way ticket to Canada, and you'll have to move in with Mum and Dad. And I know you don't want that. Mum will probably have a heart attack if she thinks you're not managing to make ends meet. And as for Dad, he'll be broken-hearted. It'll destroy him. You know what he's like. Such a sensitive soul. Our parents are getting old, Freya. They don't need this kind of stress in their lives, do they? I'm not being funny, Freya, but something has to change in your life, do you understand? It has to change. And if you must know, I'm not sad that Miles threw you out. Honestly, that relationship was doomed from the very start. You were so infatuated with him, and it wasn't really reciprocated. I suspect you didn't see this coming, but I did, you know. What do you mean? Asked Freya, reaching out for a tissue on the counter to blow her nose and wipe away the tears that were spilling down her cheeks. I mean, that man was a lost cause. He really was. I'm not even going to dignify him with referring to him by his name. I knew he would break your heart the moment I laid eyes on him. Now you need to get a grip, girl. And don't you dare bawl your eyes out over him. He's not worth crying over, don't you understand? Do you want to give him the satisfaction of wasting your tears over him? Because believe me, girl, he's not shedding a single tear over you by the sound of things. You'll probably find he's already moved this new woman into his apartment, and when he tires of her, he will spit her out just like he did you, and find a new replacement, because that kind of man, they don't change their spots. A leopard never does. Of course I won't cry over him any more, said Freya, realizing that her sister was absolutely right. She was not going to think about her boyfriend a moment longer. She needed to find a job and get a move on with her life. She needed to learn to be financially independent, but it was easier said than done. Rental costs were through the roof these days, and by the time you'd paid off the hungry piranhas from the bank loan she had acquired, and a greedy landlord who wasn't adverse to exploiting his tenants with insane rental costs, there would not be much disposable income left behind. Worse still, Freya always had a weakness for a pretty piece of jewellery in a shop window, or a cutting-edge kitchen utensil that was practically calling her name, even if it had no earthly use whatsoever. Saving for her was as alien as eating potato chips without salt. It had not been easy moving into the Trevelli household. The trouble was Rainey and her husband were neat freaks. Everything had to be just so. Not even the cushions on the perfect sofa chairs were allowed to be dented after you'd been sitting down on them. You could not relax in the Trevelli household. It was like she was always balancing on eggshells, checking over her shoulders to see she hadn't left a long trail of mess behind her. It would seem that Rainey was always on tenterhooks, and would immediately dash over to the sofa chair where Freya had been sitting only moments before, to plump up the cushions, once she had abandoned her seat. Rainey would also frantically run a hoover across those creamy carpets, as regular as clockwork. Freya's presence in their house was for the beleaguered Trevellis like welcoming in a hurricane through the kitchen window. Freya had never been particularly tidy. She hung her white fluffy towel haphazardly on the towel rail after she'd had a bath, that would drop to the floor in a fluffy puddle. She left dirty mugs around the house, plates with crumbs on after her snacks, which her sister hurriedly cleared up after her, before her husband got wind of the mess and decided to toss Freya out himself, which he would be not adverse to doing. Thornton did not pack any punches, and had gained a formidable, uncongenial reputation at the university for being ruthless with his pupils. Every evening when they shared out the take-out that Thornton had ordered for dinner, which he'd dish out generously onto dinner plates, he would look at Freya through hawk-like eyes, like a formidable headmaster, asking her unabashedly how the job hunting was actually going. When did she think she'd be moving out? He made no secret of the fact that her presence in their lives was an intrusive annoyance, like a moth that had made a happy home for itself in their Persian carpet, and was slowly but surely devouring all the wool. "Me and Rainey, we have busy lives, Freya," he had said.
We're not very good at hosting guests. I know you're Rainie's sister, which is why you are here. But I hope you will do your uttermost to get a job as soon as you possibly can. Rainie and I need our space. Your being here has caused a great deal of chaos in our lives. For without wishing to be rude, you are not exactly the tidiest house guests we've ever entertained, and you can be quite messy. The other day you brought mud into the house. We like all our shoes to be left in the entrance hall, on the shoe rack, for that very reason. We spent a fortune on our cream carpets, and we like to keep them in pristine condition, as I'm sure you can appreciate.
Of course, Thornton. I'm so sorry. I really didn't mean to leave mud on the carpet, but I did clear it up, I promise you I did, said Freya, almost choking on her chicken chow mein. I guess I just wasn't thinking. Thornton raised a cynical brow.
That's the problem with you, Freya. You don't think. You act before you employ your common sense.
If Freya wanted any sympathy for her plight, she was not going to get it here in the Trevelli household, which was why she found herself in the bar in town. Both Thornton and her sister Rainie occasionally enjoyed a glass of Chablis from time to time, but they were so annoyingly sensible they only drank the allotted units recommended for adults every week, and took an extreme dim view of anyone undisciplined who drank to excess. Rainie would always say, I don't understand people who can't stop at one glass of wine. It's so easy to say no to another glass. If they could see how many units of alcohol that Freya had inadvertently knocked back this night, both Rainie and Thornton would be visibly appalled. She could almost see Thornton's disapproving face, glowering contemptuously in the back of her mind. She knew what his thoughts on the matter would be. Freya was just a flakehead who really didn't use her brain very much. That's what he clearly thought. Freya had come to this bar in town, like so many people, lonely like she was, would do, to seek solace. She had certainly not received it from her insouciant sister and her very indifferent husband, who was emotionally barren. She could never talk to her sister Rainie openly about the pain in her heart, as Rainie would never ever relate. Tonight at the bar, if she had met the right man, she might have actually gone back to his apartment with him, just to have someone to put a loving arm around her. She wanted someone to help ease the pain of the current troubles in her life with their physical touch, like stroking the household tabby. In truth, she knew it would all be so shallow and meaningless. In most cases, the following morning, things would be embarrassing, awkward, very uncomfortable, and it was very likely the stranger would not wish to see her again, and she would likely feel the very same. Once he'd had his fill, he'd probably decide next time he'd like a blonde or a redhead instead. To be fair, this kind man tonight, plying her with drinks, did seem a decent sort, as if he was genuinely interested in her, beyond being something he could drag home to his apartment for a quick romp between the silken sheets. Indeed, he said something like, "I'd really like to get to know you better, Freya. You seem like a very interesting person." No one had ever called Freya interesting before. That was a first. But Freya wasn't ready for a relationship. She'd been so badly injured after her relationship with Miles. She felt like a dog that had been kicked in the ribs, and she was still feeling tender to the touch. In her experience, emotional wounds could be far worse than the physical sort. She couldn't get her ex-boyfriend's words out of her head. They taunted and teased her day and night, like a cat tormenting a mouse. "I fancy someone else." Who knew 4 words could be so cruel that they'd eat away at your guts like a worm in an apple? Over the last couple of months she had hated Miles with a fervent passion. He had sent her some text messages on her cell phone that she had refused to read. She had deleted every single message. She'd show him she'd moved on with her life and didn't give him a passing thought. It wasn't true, of course, but she'd like him to believe that. It might be a nagging blow to his ego. She pulled out an old brown envelope from her purse, and with her black fountain pen left a note for the kind man who had been buying her drinks, as unlike Miles, she had a heart. "Sorry, had to go. Hope to see you around sometime. Just so you know, it's not you, it's me. I'm emotionally rather redundant at the moment.
and not looking for a relationship. When she wrote the note, her fingers precariously wobbled, like blocks of ungainly cement, and the writing looked like that of a 2-year-old kid, but it was too bad, as the drink had unapologetically gone straight to her head. She managed to rise up onto her feet, glad she had decided against wearing any impractical footwear tonight. Thank God she was wearing jeans and sneakers, and wouldn't be trying to trot across the carpet in high-heel shoes. It was still a struggle to walk straight, even wearing flat shoes. God forbid if she was wearing heels. She'd make a right spectacle of herself. Ostensibly a drunken woman wearing high heels was a sight for sore eyes. To date, Freya had had enough humiliation in her young life to last an entire lifetime. She certainly didn't need any more. It seemed like an obstacle course just walking from her table, past the bar towards the glass doors of the bar. But she managed to do it, even though it felt as if she was walking on a swaggering boat at sea that was being pummelled about by the frisky, tempestuous waves on an inauspicious stormy night. She staggered past the congregation of people gathered around the bar. Many who she could sense were eyeing her up and down, but she refused to look in their direction. She breathed a huge sigh of relief when she found herself outside the glass door of the bar, and finally on the street. The cold, bracing autumn air greeted her cheeks with freezing fingers, but she embraced them happily. She gathered her wits about her as she acclimatized to the cold. A young woman was standing on the street. She was very pretty, and for a moment it looked as if she was completely naked, as her flesh-coloured dress clung to her perfectly svelte curves like a tight sock. Freya knew that this kind of dress on her might reveal a few extra bumps of unwanted adipose tissue that clung to her for dear life, as if determined to save her from the next impending famine. Freya thought the girl almost looked like a ghost, standing under the moonlight, her blonde hair flying around her heart-shaped face, her blue eyes staring vacantly into space. Freya felt she'd almost met a kindred spirit, who looked as lost and displaced as she was. The girl seemed caught up in her own dreamy world, and Freya found herself staggering rather awkwardly towards her, as the girl looked like she must be freezing to death. Freya finally approached her. "Are you all right?" she asked the girl. "Not really," said the girl. "I came out here onto the street to call a taxi. Someone has just snatched my purse. Can you believe it? I had everything in it. My wallet, my cell phone, my camera, all my money. I don't know what I'm going to do." Freya, even in her inebriated state, felt such empathy for this woman. "I'll call you a cab if you like, to take you home." "I cannot ask you to do that," said the girl. "I just can't." "Of course you can. Call it a gift. You can pay it forward," said Freya, knowing that her bank account would not endure much further erosion, as the numbers were forever dwindling. But she couldn't turn her back on this stranger. "I'm calling a cab. I'll ask them to drop you at your address, and then it'll drop me at mine, if we live in a similar area. Otherwise I'll call you an independent taxi, and pay your fare in advance for you. How does that suit you?" "If you're sure," said the girl appreciatively, "that would be most kind. My name is Tina Crosscrow, by the way. I'm currently staying at the Virginia Highland neighbourhood with friends of the family." "That's good," said Freya. "My sister lives in the Piedmont Park neighbourhood. They virtually collide into each other in a manner of speaking. We can definitely share the same taxi cab, so the taxi can kill 2 birds with 1 stone if you like. My name is Freya Frost, by the way," she said to the girl, chuckling. "It's not difficult to remember." Freya was aware that she was beginning to slur her words. She managed to pull out her cell phone out of her purse and call for a cab. "Yes, we're outside the public draft house, the gastropub on the corner of Peach Street and Prince de Leon Avenue, directly opposite the Ponce Kitchen and the bar. That's right." "Yes, you know the one." "That's right. There are 2 of us." She gave the taxi driver the 2 addresses, and they stood on the pavement, waiting for the taxi to arrive. "So what happened?" asked Freya, turning to the young woman. "Did you see the person that snatched your purse?" "Not really. I was about to call a taxi, but I was bending down to look at a dead bird in the road. I think someone ran the poor thing over. I was bending over to look at it closely to see if it really was dead. I felt this hard tug from behind me. I looked up and this young man dashed away with my purse in his hand. I saw a flash of his white sweatshirt,
and then that was it. I called after him, stop, and tried to give him chase, but he ran like a cheetah, and after a couple of drinks, I felt a little wobbly on my feet, so I gave up on the chase. I'm so sorry. I really am. It's awful when something like that happens." "It's no biggie," said Tina. "I've had worse things happen in my life, believe me. A bag being snatched from me is pie in the sky." "Don't worry," said Freya sympathetically. "Let me tell you, my life is on a downward trajectory at the moment. Everything's gone awry. So join the club of the disenfranchised. My boyfriend ditched me for a newer model. I was made redundant. I'm now living with my punctilious sister and her overbearing husband, who's made it very clear that I'm not welcome in their home. But without their charity, I'd be homeless. So you have to be grateful for any scraps you can get, don't you?" "I'm so sorry. That really sucks," said Tina, pulling a face. "It never rains, does it? It always pours. I find when bad things happen, they all seem to happen at once. That reminds me, Freya, I need to take down your details," said Tina. "Have you got a pen and paper that I can use?" "Sure," said Freya, rustling around in her purse to pull out an old envelope and a pen, which she handed to Tina. "Here, you can use this if you like." The girl was scribbling away on the back of the envelope. "You're Freya Frost, isn't that right? What is your address?" she asked. "The address of your sister, that is." "If this is about paying me back for the taxi," said Freya, "there's absolutely no need. In fact, if the truth be told, I'd like you not to pay me back. I know it sounds crazy, but right now my sister is helping me out of all the messes I'm currently embroiled in. It feels good to help someone else, so that I don't feel like a complete loser, if that makes any sense. You've helped me get an ounce of my self-respect back. I'm only giving you my details if you fancy getting together for a drink one night. It would be fun. I think you and I might be able to nurse each other's wounds, in a manner of speaking. My sister is about as sympathetic to my current plight as a cobra is towards the rat it's ingesting." Tina laughed. "That's terrible. You and I are like birds of a feather, aren't we?" The young woman looked at Freya affectionately. "You shouldn't demean yourself like this. You're a lovely person, Freya. So what if your life's a little topsy-turvy? For the record, mine's a haystack, in which the needle that's holding it together can never be found. In other words, I'm an unfixable mess. You, on the other hand, you can easily be fixed. My bet is your problems could be over in a second. Mine, on the other hand, I'll likely carry with me to the grave. Some problems you cannot shake off. Sorry to sound so melodramatic." "Don't apologise, Tina, for that. You're entitled to feel flustered after being robbed. I would too if I was in your shoes. Oh, and thanks, by the way, for the compliment. But I assure you I am far from lovely," said Freya. "I can assure you my sister and her husband would testify to that without any problems." "Well, I wouldn't be interested in what they had to say," said Tina. "I'm quite capable of making up my own mind about people. And I say you're lovely, so no arguing over this matter." Freya said nothing, for she noticed that Tina looked rather melancholic, as if her mind was over 1,000 miles away, and suddenly Freya was most sure that she was not the most troubled soul in Atlanta. It would seem there were others considerably worse off than she was emotionally. This was not something that had actually occurred to her before, although, to be fair, Tina Crosscrow was not forthcoming about herself. She seemed rather elusive and somewhat evasive, and probably buttoned up her emotions, squirreling them away like a squirrel clandestinely stashing its acorns for the winter. Freya could tell that Tina Crosscrow was indeed a lost soul, if she'd ever seen one before. How she knew this, she didn't exactly know, but she felt it tangibly. "Here," she said to her kindly, "have my windbreaker. You look freezing in that dress. We're not in summer yet, you know. And although I will admit you have a figure to die for that deserves to be shown off, this is not the time to do it, unless you want to end up like that poor bird on the side of the road, frozen to death." Tina looked at the bird wistfully. "At least it's at peace now, isn't it? All its troubles long behind it. It never has to worry again, does it? I envy that bird. I really do." Freya peered at Tina curiously. "Your life can't be that bad, can it?" she asked her. Tina gave her a watery smile. "It depends on what you mean by bad," she said. Before Freya was able to question Tina any further, the taxi arrived, and the two girls clambered awkwardly into the back of the car. The garrulous taxi driver talked chirpily as he took them to their respective locations. When the taxi arrived at Tina's address, where she claimed to be staying with an old friend of hers, she did something that rather surprised Freya. She grabbed Freya by both hands, giving them a tight squeeze. She then impulsively kissed Freya tenderly on the sides of both of her cheeks, and then whispered into her ear, "Please keep it, if you can bear to." What the hell did she mean by that? Freya wondered. She was so drunk tonight that nothing made sense to her at all. But little did she know, this random meeting or chance encounter with Tina Crosscrow would change her life, and she'd never ever see Tina Crosscrow again. 2 months later, Freya woke up in her bed to hear an argument going on in the living room downstairs. She had never ever heard her sister having an argument before with her husband. Freya's ears were flapping. Could it be the seemingly perfect relationship her sister claimed to have with her husband Thornton was beginning to show a few cracks after all? If there were a few loose floorboards in the foundations of their relationship, or a leak in the seemingly incorruptible roof, it would make Freya feel significantly better about herself and her abysmal record with men to date. She had always ended up drawing the short end of the straw when it came to relationships, and it had been the perennial beleaguered story of her life. She had grown used to being dumped or thrown to the wayside like an old piece of tobacco being spat out on the curb. Rainey had always told her that Freya picked the wrong men, which was the quintessential predominant reason her relationships fell apart. But with a current heated rampage going on downstairs, maybe Rainey had painted her husband in far too favourable a light. Love could be blind after all. Maybe things weren't quite so rosy in the garden with Rainey and her husband Thornton after all. "We never fight, Thornton and I," Rainey had told her once very proudly. "We just respect each other. That's what you need in a relationship, Freya. A man that will respect you." If the truth be told, Freya had never ever warmed to the supercilious Thornton. She had always found the toffee-nosed, lofty, imperious man incredibly condescending towards her, as if he thought she was made up of fluff and a whole lot of hot air. With an unquenchable intrigue, she silently tiptoed cautiously down the staircase, ensuring that her footsteps were clandestine on their approach. Fortunately, the cold stainless steel staircase, with about as much personality and charm as Thornton himself, did not creak, unlike the staircases of obvious character in more historic homes. Everything in her sister's minimalistic, no-nonsense house was robustly strong, aloof, and unfriendly. After she descended the rigidly stiff staircase, she crept up stealthily across the cream carpet to the living-room door, which had been left slightly ajar. Her ears were burning. She stood very still for a moment, hearing her name mentioned in the conversation. She drew in a deep breath. She might have known that the argument centred around her unsolicited, scorned presence in their household. She was the catalyst that had blown a tempestuous storm into her sister's life, and ruffled Thornton's feathers considerably. And by the sounds of things he had become like a hot kettle on the hob, boiling over with infuriation. She realised she had long since outstayed her welcome, and this unsettling revelation fired her up with a guilty conscience. It was true. She'd been here for far too long. She was dependent on her sister, as without her she'd have to return home to Canada, cap in hand, begging her parents to dig her out of the unfortunate hole she found herself buried in. She couldn't bear the prospect of doing that. She did have some pride left after all. Her parents would be disappointed in her when they gleaned what a complete mess she'd made of her life, despite the fact that they had invested so much financially in her education. Parents always naturally expected their children to do better than they did in life. Her father had said, "I want my kids to reach for the stars, to go places that I never could, which is why I believe in investing in my kids' education." The trouble is that unlike her sister Rainey, Freya had never been that bright at school. Her abysmal grades had been very disappointing. But she had shown promise in the arts and anything creative. Freya knew everything she touched seemed to go awry. Thornton's voice boomed in the living room so loudly that the wine glasses in the bar area began to rattle precariously. "But when is she bloody going, Rainey?" came Thornton's outraged voice. "She's been here for 2 months. There are no signs of her leaving at all. I've had enough of her squatting in our home, taking advantage of our hospitality. You know I have never been comfortable with her living here with us. And by the looks of things, she's getting far too comfortable living under our roof. And whenever I ask her when she intends to leave, she's very conveniently vague about it, mumbles under her breath something about needing to find a job. I've had enough of her, Rainey. For so long I've put up with her for your sake, not mine. But I have to draw a line in the sand. I've had enough, and I want her out." "But she's been trying her damnedest to get a job, Thornton. You're being so unreasonable. I mean, she really has been trying. She's gone to lots and lots of interviews, but no one is hiring at the moment. Once she gets her feet onto solid ground, she'll be out of here, I promise you. I'm sure she'll find something soon enough. The kind of job she's looking for is rather specialised." "Specialised? Are you kidding me?" said Thornton contemptuously. "What are you smoking, Rainey? Your sister spends her life selling people knickers. You hear me, woman? Knickers. There's nothing specialised about doing that. What's wrong with you, Rainey? Have you gone all soft all of a sudden? I thought you didn't like her being here any more than I do." "But she's my sister, Thornton. What am I supposed to do? Throw her out onto the streets? How could I live with myself if I did that? You're an only child. You don't understand. But I have a duty of responsibility to my sister. And besides, if I do send her home to Canada, I don't know what it will do to Mum and Dad. My parents, they're not going to take it very well." "Rainey, I don't give a damn. You hear me? I don't give a damn. Can you see what she's doing? She's worming her way into our lives. I want her out. I've never had much time for her. When she cooked a meal for us the other day, the mess was terrible. I was in the kitchen all night clearing up after her. I'm sorry, but if you don't tell her to go, I will." "Thornton, just give her another month, please. If she doesn't find a job, I'll send her to Canada myself, I promise you, to be with Mum and Dad." Freya did not want to listen to anything more. She'd heard enough. The idea of being sent back to her childhood home in Montreal was far from easy to digest. She couldn't bear to see the bitter disappointment in her parents' faces when they realised she had failed to support herself financially. It would grieve their hearts exponentially, given that they had invested so much in their children's education over the years and made monumental sacrifices. She knew they would blame themselves for not being better parents in some way. She knew her father would be digging in his pockets, trying to help her out as best he could. He'd be eager to pay for her to do a course or something to get back on her feet. But they needed their money now that they were retired, and she didn't want to take advantage of their kindness. But by the looks of things, if things didn't change very soon, she'd be given a one-way ticket to Montreal, and her worst fears would be realised. Rainey did not want this to happen either, for her any more than she did. She knew that her brother-in-law did not like her hanging around his house like a bad smell, and he had made no secret that he found her presence in their home an annoying intrusion. But she didn't enjoy sponging on their hospitality either. Thornton had always looked down on her after the first time he'd asked her what she did for a living, as if her job in some way reflected who she was as a person. And in his opinion, selling stuff was not something that required engaging your brain cells. Did he have any idea how wrong he was about that? Everyone knew that everything in life revolved around sales, and people needed guidance when buying stuff, from car tires to the products a dentist buys for his surgery. You need to buy these things from someone who knows what they're talking about, or you could end up in heaps of trouble.
So you're a shop girl, are you?
Thornton had said snootily, looking at her pitifully, as if she'd announced she was born with 3 legs and was in some way severely disabled. That's right. I work in an underwear department, helping women with fittings. I help them select the right underwear for the best support. Some women with very big breasts get terrible back problems. It makes all the difference for them if they're wearing the right size bra to get decent support. That's where I come in. Some chiropractors actually refer their clients to me because some back problems are caused by very heavy breasts, so they need specialized support or otherwise breast reduction surgery to address the problem. I also help women with nursing bras for breastfeeding, stuff like that, so they can find an easy, more convenient way to feed their baby. Beyond that, so many women are wearing the wrong bra size. I know at once what size they are, just by looking at them, based on my years of training, and when they receive a fitting from me, they feel so much better about themselves. Imagine wearing glasses that kept sliding down your nose. It's a little like that. Most women don't know their size. They think they do, but they don't. I also help women who've lost their breast in a mastectomy. I help them with padding and stuff like that. Many of them lose their confidence, and I help make them feel better about themselves because when they wear the padded bra, they look normal again. You cannot tell that they've lost their breasts at all. I have had all the training, so I know my stuff. Many of the women I meet say I've changed their lives. Their back pain has gone, their confidence restored. And in my book, that's a pretty big deal, Thornton. So no, I wouldn't call myself a shop girl, as you so put it. I've had a specialised training. Even the Queen of England goes to a specialist for her undergarments, you know. Thornton snorted. Furthermore, he looked very bored, as he had listened to her harp on about underwear. He certainly did not take her seriously, and that was affirmed when he cluelessly said,
"Call it what you want, Freya, but you're a glorified shop girl, the way I see it. Look at me. I don't need any help when I'm buying my boxers and briefs. I'm in and out of the shop faster than you can say Jack Robinson. Rainie's much the same, aren't you, dear? She doesn't need anyone helping her with her smalls. Without wishing to be rude, personally I thought my wife's sister would be doing something more useful and productive with her life, rather than helping people select their smalls. Your father invested big money into your education, and even sent you to college, and you're selling underwear for a living. It's a bloody joke. I'm sorry, but it is. Do your parents know what you do for a living?"
"No, they don't, and I would appreciate, Thornton, if you didn't tell them, because they might think like you do. They're rather old-fashioned. It's a good job, though, we're not all academic like you, Thornton," Freya had retorted. "If we were, who would do the practical stuff in our lives? It makes sense that we all have different skills. Otherwise, our lives wouldn't work."
"I think I could survive without someone helping me with my briefs,"
he had said dismissively. Freya wanted to slap him across his patronising face so hard, but she just walked away, knowing that you couldn't reason with some people, and Thornton would never come off his arrogant pedestal, as he enjoyed living in his gilded cage, looking at the world through a very distorted pair of lenses. Freya slept in late the following morning, until she finally heard the front door slamming behind Rainie and her brother-in-law, and knew that they had left the property to go to their sensible jobs at the university. She sighed with relief when she finally had the place to herself for the next few hours, without having to face Thornton glowering at her disapprovingly over the breakfast table, especially after she'd overheard him whinging and moaning about how much he wanted Freya to leave their home. She knew her time was running out here at her sister's house. It was growing increasingly apparent that Thornton could not wait to kick her out, so she needed to find a job fast, and she couldn't afford to be choosy. She'd have to pick any department store job, rather than her speciality job selling and fitting underwear on grateful customers. She also needed to find affordable accommodation, otherwise she'd be returning to her childhood home in Canada, to throw an unwanted grenade in her parents' lives, when she had to admit that she was jobless and couldn't afford a roof over her head. They were completely in the dark about her current state of affairs. Ostensibly, both her mother and dad had faced some health issues of late, and Rainey didn't think it would be wise to tell them about Freya's recent screw-ups. When Freya phoned them, she'd spin out tall stories about how great everything was. She was doing so well at work, as a medical secretary, which was of course a barefaced lie, and her relationship looked likely to end in marriage. "Oh, I'm so glad, sweetheart," her mother had said to her over the telephone. "I do so want to see you happily settled down like your sister Rainey, my love. It'll mean I can go to bed with a load off my mind, not having to worry about you at all, knowing that someone is taking care of you. And your boyfriend sounds absolutely wonderful. I can't wait for us to meet him when you finally tie the knot. Me and your father, we always worry about you. But knowing you have such a fabulous boyfriend and an amazing job brings me great peace of mind." Once the house had successfully regurgitated its unwanted residents and had slipped into a congenial silence, Freya clambered rather awkwardly down the staircase. She badly needed a cup of coffee, even if it was decaffeinated, in order to get her day started. Her cell phone began to ring obtrusively. She glanced down at the caller ID, which flashed in her face, unknown caller. She marvelled how complete strangers trying to sell her funeral cover or home insurance had somehow managed to acquire her number and annoyingly call her over and over again. She would normally not answer the call, but she fancied telling someone to get lost, to let off the steam that was boiling up inside her. "Hello," she said brusquely. "Hello," came a man's voice. "Am I speaking to Miss Freya Frost?" "That's right, you are. It's Freya Frost speaking." "Good. I'm glad to have got you in person, Miss Frost. My name is Connor Sanderson Parker. I'm phoning from Bronson and Barkwell Solicitors concerning the deceased estate of Miss Tina Crosscrow." "Sorry," said Freya. "I think you've got the wrong number. The name rings a bell, but I don't know a Tina Crosscrow. Hold on a moment. Now I remember. I did meet a girl of that name recently. I gave her a lift in a taxi about 2 months back. You're not saying she's dead?" "I'm afraid so. Sorry to be the bearer of such sad, very tragic news." Freya gasped. "She was such a sweet person. How did she die? That is so terrible." "Well, I think it would be much better if you would come to our offices," said the solicitors. "I can explain everything to you when we meet face to face. Some things are not appropriate to discuss over the phone, I'm sure you appreciate." "Look, it's not necessary," said Freya. "I told Tina that she didn't need to pay me back for the taxi fare that night. I told her it wasn't a big deal, and I'm fine by that." "Look, Miss Frost, this is not about an overdue taxi tariff. Nothing of the kind. As I said, it would be in your interest to come into our offices. Would 3 o'clock this afternoon suit you?" "Fine," said Freya, taking down the address and feeling heartily annoyed that she needed to go to Tina's solicitors. What could they possibly want with her? It would be an awful inconvenience when her focus was to find a job, but she would do it for Tina Crosscrow. She had felt a kindred connection with the sad woman. She couldn't believe that she was actually dead. How could this have happened to one so young? She was surprised to find a couple of tears spilling down her cheeks. Get a grip, she told herself. You didn't even know the girl very well. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Freya arrived promptly at the solicitor's office. The middle-aged, grey-haired woman at the reception was wearing a classic Armani suit. She beckoned for Freya to take a seat on a very glamorous-looking L-shaped sofa in the waiting room. Freya suddenly felt rather self-conscious in this upmarket attorney's office because she was wearing a pair of casual jeans. This place did not do jeans. She should have worn something smarter, like her pleated black pantsuit that she wore for her job when she worked in the department store. It was too late for that, she thought with regret, suddenly feeling conspicuously scruffy. She glanced around at the pretentious glossy copies of Town and Country, intermingled with Harper's Bazaar, Vogue, Tatler, Good Housekeeping, and Hello, and many other trendy-looking magazines, spread out liberally across the glass coffee table. She pretended to be busily scanning through her cell phone when the receptionist looked up at her directly and said, "Mr. Sanderson Parker will see you now, Freya. His office is the second door to the right. Just go through, will you?" she said, peering at Freya through a pair of sophisticated zooty pink glasses and giving her a warm, encouraging smile. Mr. Sanderson Parker was an eccentric-looking man who looked as if he had come off the cover of Town and Country magazine. Although he was clearly American, he looked remarkably English, like one of the men you might encounter visiting Downton Abbey in the post-war era, who had returned home with a pheasant in his hand after a very dignified shoot, wearing a tweed jacket and a pair of traditional English Wellington boots, with a black Labrador running at his side. In truth, he didn't look like he belonged in this generation at all, and his marked eccentricity was very endearing. For a moment Freya thought she was on a movie set, applying for a job at Downton Abbey as a lady's maid, only the jeans just didn't work for the part. If the solicitor thought she looked scruffy and out of place, like a flower growing in the wilderness, he gave nothing away. Mr. Sanderson Parker was wearing a very debonair tweed jacket, a smart white cotton shirt, a silken cravat that was tucked neatly into his collar. The man had a full head of grey curls that tumbled over his face rather messily, and had long old-fashioned sideburns and bushy eyebrows, with stray hairs that desperately needed a trim, and Freya kept longing to pull out her nail scissors to do just that for him, but she bit her lip instead and smiled bashfully at the solicitor. She couldn't imagine what on earth she was doing here, in these luxurious offices. The man was probably in his early 60s. He appeared distinguished and unquestionably upper class, reeking of the kind of old money that comes down from a substantial inheritance. He looked as if he was born with a plum in his mouth, as if his life had been crowned with great privilege. He had likely attended some of the poshest schools and universities in the country when he was a boy. But he was both charming, friendly, and seemingly very kind, almost as if he sympathetically understood that she felt like a fish out of water, swimming among sharks in his office. He stood up from his leather swivel chair, very politely, when Freya entered his formal office. He shook her hand vigorously. Freya felt rather embarrassed. Her hands were clammy. His were firm and dry. "Thank you very much for coming, Miss Frost. I do appreciate it very much. Please, will you take a seat?" he said, beckoning to a very formal-looking upholstered wing chair. Freya sat down rather gratefully, clutching her purse tightly to her chest, in a self-soothing gesture, and said rather gingerly, "I don't understand what this is about, Mr. Sanderson Parker." She crinkled her eyebrows. I don't understand what this is about, Mr. Sanderson Parker," said Freya, crinkling her eyebrows. "As I told you, I didn't actually know Tina Crosscrow. I met her outside a bar. She'd been robbed. Some nasty bugger stole her purse, I'm afraid. She was without funds to get a taxi home. I just helped her out, but I never knew her. How did she die? I got an awful shock when you told me the tragic news. She was so young, like myself. She had a whole life ahead of her." "I'm afraid to inform you, Miss Frost, that Miss Tina Crosscrow threw herself off a bridge and lined the dress she was wearing with weights to ensure that she drowned successfully. Her body was recovered on the same day by divers, as a witness saw her jump and reported the event to the police. I regret to say it was too late to be able to save her." "But I don't understand," gasped Freya. "It's none of my business, I know, but why would she do that to herself?" "I don't know the details of her life, Miss Frost. I was just her family solicitor. She came to see me a couple of days before her death, to make some final adjustments to her will, which is why you find yourself here today." "With the greatest of respect, Mr. Sanderson Parker, what have I got to do with the will of Tina Crosscrow? I told you, I didn't even know her." "I think this might answer your question, Miss Frost. Tina wrote you a letter that you were to receive as her beneficiary in the event of her death. She was most insistent that I was to personally hand it to you. I said to her that I was likely to go long before she did. She laughed and she said she was sure I was wrong about that.
which I thought was a little odd, but I humoured her nevertheless.
Beneficiary, said Freya, looking nonplussed. Please, will you read the letter? I'm just having trouble digesting all of this. Are you saying that she's left me something in her will? I'm surprised Tina's got anything to leave. If I was to die now, I'd not have a thing to leave anyone in my family.
I think I'd better read you the letter, said the solicitor, and we will see where we go to from here. Maybe Tina's letter will be explanatory. I hope it is, he said with a twinkle in his eyes.
Freya nodded nervously, gulping the air in the office. Please go ahead. She watched the solicitor open the manila envelope and read a letter written on beautiful paper in the most magnificent curly writing that Freya had ever seen. Dear Freya, if you are reading this letter, I am very likely deceased. Please do not feel sorry for me. I do not need anyone's pity, nor do I want it. I'm in a much better place now, just like the dead bird on the side of the road. This is where I want to be. I assure you I did not take this decision lightly, but thought about it long and hard. So this was not impulsive by any manner of means. I honestly saw this as my only way out, where at last I could find the peace I so desperately seek. And peace has been lacking in my life. It has been beyond my grasp, like a kid trying to reach the candies on the top shelf, but their arm is just not long enough to reach. My arm has never been able to reach any joy in my life. In truth, I would liken myself to a candle with a blunt wick that just cannot be lighted, for I feel dead inside. The fire in me has gone out. Why did I want to end my life, is what I am sure you must be asking yourself, for the idea is probably absurdly incongruous to you. Let's just say it's complicated. From my early childhood, things have been tough for me, for reasons I don't want to go into right now. For if indeed I did, I'd probably need to write an encyclopedia, and I frankly don't have the energy for such things. But trust me when I say, my life has been a living hell. I have not been able to overcome the post-traumatic stress disorder I acquired in my very early life, that unapologetically left its indelible scars in me, that I have been unable to shake off. There was a time for me when I actually did see light at the end of a long tunnel, and my therapy sessions appeared to be working. I thought that at long last I'd be able to come out of the ambiguous fog of my hazy life, but it was not to be, as the trauma I experienced so young as a kid came back to bite me very hard. All of a sudden things spiraled out of control, and I couldn't cope with living in my own skin, and I wanted out. You may wonder why you're sitting in a solicitor's office, and why I would leave a perfect stranger, my beloved Sweet Pea. But on that night, when my world came crashing down on me, you were the one person who was in a bad place in your life that showed me care and great kindness. I could also see a sadness in your eyes, how overwhelmed you were with your lot, just like I was. I could see myself reflected in you. It takes a bird with a broken wing to recognize another bird with a broken wing. I knew at once I had met a kindred spirit in you, someone who, very much like myself, has been shipwrecked more times in their lives than they care to count. I couldn't fix myself, but maybe I could go some way to help fixing your broken wing, and that would help me to depart this earth, feeling a wee bit better about myself. I understand if you want to sell the Sweet Pea, but it would be cool if you could bear to hang on to the place, for it has been my home. I hope too that it can be yours. All my love, your friend, Tina Crosscrow. Freya stared at the solicitor incredulously. I don't know what to say. This is the most outlandish, crazy thing that has ever happened to me in my life. It's like something you'd expect to happen in a novel or in the movies, but not in real life.
It is extraordinary, said Mr. Sanderson Parker. But then you know what they say. Truth can be stranger than fiction.
You know what, Mr. Sanderson Parker? That is a very good point. I know it sounds awful, but on the night that I met Tina Crosscrow, she had just had her bag snatched. She looked so sorrowful. It wasn't about losing her purse. I knew it was something that went far deeper than that. I remember privately thinking to myself that I'd met someone who's had life worse than I have, and actually feeling in that moment a bit better about myself as a result. And now I feel dreadful for thinking like that.
It is human nature to think like that, I suspect. If we notice somebody's having a greater struggle than we are, our struggle doesn't seem quite so bad, does it? Don't give yourself a hard time about thinking like that. It is what it is.
So then what is the Sweet Pea?
The Sweet Pea is a cottage on a sizable plot of land, situated in the Georgia countryside. Very idyllic, I might add. Tina has left you her cottage with all its contents, along with $10,000 in her bank account. She's left the rest of her money to her brother Zach, which was a sizable amount, I hasten to say. There are 3 cottages on this land. The main house is owned by the Partridge family, although it was the original house that Tina Crosscrow and her brother Zach grew up in as children. When they got older, they chose to sell the main house to the Partridges. Then, of course, Tina owns the cottage called Sweet Pea, and then there is her brother's cottage known as the White Swan. The land itself is shared freely by all 3 properties. Tina has left the cottage to you, so these are the keys for the Sweet Pea, said the solicitor, handing Freya a key with a fluffy bird on the keyring. Freya took the key from the solicitor's hand with a vacillating hesitancy. The large bird on the keyring reminded her of a finch, rather like the bird that Tina had seen on the side of the road, whom she'd envied for being at peace. How can I possibly accept this, Mr. Sanderson Parker? It's very generous. I mean, what would her brother Zach think? That she leaves a perfect stranger a cottage? By rights, shouldn't the Sweet Pea belong to him? Absolutely not, said Mr. Sanderson Parker resolutely. The Sweet Pea belonged to Tina Crosscrow. It was her property. She wanted you to inherit the property. She was most insistent about this. Does not a deceased person have a right to do what they desire with their things after they are gone? Tina very much wanted you to own the Sweet Pea. It is a gift from her to you. She said giving it to you made her feel better about herself. So I think you should accept this gift as it was intended.
Of course you're right, Mr. Sanderson Parker. I just don't know what to say. This has come as such a shock to me. It was only when Freya had left the solicitor's office, the gravity of what had just transpired had knocked her off her perch. She suddenly realized that she was no longer homeless. She had a cottage in Georgia and $10,000 in her bank account. She could leave her sister's property now and get out of Thornton's hair, and that was a very satisfactory feeling indeed. She could smell her independence like a fragrant floral bouquet. I own a cottage! I own a cottage! She kept saying to herself under her breath. I have my own property now. There was no reason to wait. She wasn't welcome in her sister's home. Not really. She had heard the argument that had erupted in the living room the night before, and the unkind words that had been spoken about her. She knew what she needed to do. She'd leave a note for her sister, and buy her a huge bouquet of flowers and a basket of fruit, and leave it on the kitchen counter, and get the hell out of their home. She'd call a taxi to drive her straight to the Sweet Pea cottage in Georgia, and when she left behind her sister's home, she had a profound sense that she'd never ever have to exploit her sister's hospitality again, and that was a satisfactory feeling indeed. Only a day ago she was having horrifying visions of returning home to Canada, and now here she was, like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon, ready to embrace a bright new future that lay ahead of her. Freya left her sister a note saying, Dear Sis, thank you for having me to stay at your home. I really appreciate your kindness. I don't want to outstay my welcome. I know I already have. I'm sorry to have put you and Thornton out. I've found a very comfortable place to stay, where I will be very happy, I'm sure. Don't worry about me. Freya. It was at about 6 o'clock in the evening, when fully packed she sat in the back of a taxicab, staring at the front door keys of Sweet Pea Cottage, which for her would open a door to a whole new life, one way or another. She found her frisky thoughts were whirling around her head like the clothes in a tumble-dryer. She tried to focus on her random, serendipitous encounter with Tina Crosscrow, her strange, rather peculiar meeting with a solicitor, and all the oddities that had transpired so far. She felt rather like a character in a novel, playing an idiosyncratic part, wondering where her exciting journey would ultimately take her, through the writer's eyes. Tears began to glisten in her eyes, threatening to slide down her cheeks like lonely raindrops from heaven. She fought them back furiously. She had nothing to cry about. She was in a very privileged position right now. It would seem her whole life had spun around on its axis and was on an upward trajectory finally. It was hard not to get emotional over her good news. She had no idea what the future held for her, and whether she would keep or sell Sweet Pea Cottage. She would live there for a while, until she decided what she wanted to do with the place. She recalled Tina Crosscrow's strange words that she had whispered in her ears before she'd said goodbye to her when she'd left the taxi. "Keep it! Keep it if you can bear to!" At the time she wondered what Tina was on about. Tina Crosscrow had clearly decided on their meeting she wanted to give Freya Sweet Pea Cottage, which was why she had taken down all her contact details. Now everything made sense. For so long she had felt rather like a stray dog in a shelter, hanging on to the lost, beleaguered hope that she would ever find a new home. But today, a cottage, by magic, had just fallen into her lap, rather like manna from heaven. But she hoped this gift would not turn to be a pile of maggots. The taxi driver tried to engage in small talk with her, constantly looking at her through the visor mirror, with his curious, beady brown eyes, hoping for a titbit to be thrown his way, like a hungry seagull, so that he could thoroughly enjoy a good hearty conversation, to nourish the journey that lay ahead of him. But the girl sitting in the back seat wasn't throwing out even a measly morsel of conversation. He noticed she seemed so caught up in her own thoughts. He sighed. This was going to be one of those dull drives, where every minute stretched out like a rubber band. He turned up the radio onto a phone-in program about the horrors people had experienced in online dating websites. People were phoning in to share their own mortifying stories.
"We have Sadie Remington here, who's going to tell us about her encounter with a very unusual individual."
"Yes, it was very bizarre," said Sadie. "I met him. At first he looked like an ordinary, very reasonable 32-year-old man. He was wearing a jacket, and we sat down and ordered hors d'oeuvres and everything. And then he took off his jacket, and I discovered to my horror that he was wearing a Superman outfit. Now I ask you, can you believe that? I realized that he was very much into his childhood hero, and he wouldn't let it go at 32 years old. I realized the date from that point was going badly wrong, and I needed to get out of there fast. And believe me, I did." Freya was not listening to the conversation. Whatever was being said on the radio, she didn't notice. She seemed to have turned herself off from the environment around her, as if turning a faucet tightly shut at the kitchen sink. She closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting like a log on the water towards Tina Crosscrow. She tried to replay her brief encounter she'd had with Tina Crosscrow in her head, like pressing the redial on a video recording. She could see the slim, blonde-haired girl, looking so lost and defeated on the sidewalk outside the bar. What could have been so dreadfully bad for her to have decided to take her own life like this? Tina Crosscrow had mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder in her letter to Freya, but had not gone into much detail about that. It would seem that some skeletons from her past had haunted her life so dreadfully that they had swallowed up her desire to live, and like a hungry piranha had gobbled up the meat of the bright future that lay ahead of her like an unexplored road map. Freya slipped into a deep sleep. Her head bobbed up and down in the taxicab with the momentum of the car. Drool spilled down the corners of her mouth. She did not notice the taxi driving steadily through the bright lights of the city, nor did she hear the taxi driver cursing abruptly from time to time at some rather atrocious driving on the road. Freya did not observe how dark it had suddenly become, and how the smooth roads after the taxi had turned off the interstate had become significantly more bumpy. She didn't even hear the taxi driver saying, "We're very nearly there, ma'am." Freya remained fast asleep at the back of the taxi. She failed to hear the voice saying, "Ma'am, we're here. This is Sweet Pea Cottage. Ma'am, we're here. We're here." At first Freya thought the voice was part of her dream, until she felt a hand on her shoulder and jumped. Freya's startled eyes widened in confusion as she snapped out of her sleep with such a start. She almost screamed when she saw the strange face looming over her. Oh my God! They'd just had a home invasion at her sister's house. She had woken up to a nightmare. She trembled. "Take anything you want! Take anything you want!" she cried out. "Please, please don't hurt me!" She lifted her hands above her face, as if trying to fight off any danger. Ma'am, I think you've had a bad dream. You're in a taxi. You asked me to drive you here. We've reached your destination. This is Sweet Pea Cottage." Freya rubbed her eyes in bewilderment. "So this isn't a dream?" she asked. The taxi driver looked at Freya rather strangely, with a bewildered, confounded expression on his face. "No, it's not a dream," he assured her. "You're at Sweet Pea Cottage. You asked me to drive you here. Don't you remember?" "Oh, I'm so sorry. I just was in a very deep sleep, I think." Freya was glad it was so dark outside, that the taxi driver couldn't see that her cheeks were burning with embarrassment, as all the events of the unorthodox day she had experienced came flooding back to her like a fictitious story in a novel that she was still trying to digest. "I'm so sorry," she muttered. I just guess I was a little confused and tired, that's all. I thought I was in my bed at my sister's house. I thought you'd broken in. I'm sorry I reacted so strangely." "Don't worry about me, ma'am. Dreams can feel very real at times, and you did sleep very deeply the whole way here. You must have been very exhausted." Freya tried to make sense of her bearings as the taxi driver opened her door and pulled out her suitcase from the trunk. He kindly wheeled it over to the front door for her. In the headlights of the taxi, Freya could see the outline of a whimsical white cottage. She observed wisteria and red roses tumbling over the glossy red front door. Her first impression was that this was a charming little cottage, but given it was dark, she couldn't see very much. The kind taxi driver had bid her farewell. He had waited patiently in his car for her to finally open the door. With trembling hands, the door creaked open. The taxi driver started up his engine, and his car whizzed away after he'd blown his horn, as if to say goodbye. And then he was gone, and everything became eerily quiet. The comforting sounds of a bustling city she was so used to hearing were long gone. She could only hear the sounds of the countryside, the sounds of crickets and frogs. Suddenly she felt dreadfully alone. The cottage was swaddled in darkness. She couldn't see a damn thing. She fumbled awkwardly around the wall for a light switch and breathed a sigh of relief when she actually found one and was able to switch it on, so that a congenial light flooded the entrance hall. Freya sighed with relief. She could barely keep her eyes open. Why was she so exhausted? She felt as if she was caught up in the throes of a deep sleep. But the first thing that hit her so hard, like a punch to the head, was the disgusting putrid smell that greeted her nostrils, which seemed like an ominous welcome. She followed the source of the stench, which led her to a spotless kitchen. The smell was so offensive, it was burning the back of her throat and causing her eyes to water. Then she discovered the foul source of the smell, lying in the kitchen sink, crawling with maggots. It looked to be a deceased raccoon. What the hell was it doing in the kitchen sink? Freya blocked her nose and felt an urgent desire to vomit, but she held back the bitter bile bubbling up in the back of her throat. She fumbled around awkwardly under the white wooden kitchen cupboards and thankfully found some black bin liners. Freya managed, with a pair of rubber gloves she found on the sideboard, to extract the ghastly thing in the kitchen sink and throw it in the bag outside the kitchen window. She would deal with it in the morning,
while she left the windows open to air the entire place. This was not the kind of welcome she had been anticipating. It seemed rather foreboding. The smell in the kitchen was, in fact, so revolting that even after the offender had been expunged, it remained for several days. Freya made a brief tour of the cottage from room to room. Everything was pristinely tidy, but there was not much evidence to suggest that the house had ever belonged to Tina Crosscrow. It was almost as if she had thrown everything personal away, as if to eradicate every last trace of her life. It was almost as if she'd never existed. The girl must have cleared her stuff away, discarded it in the tip before she committed the fatal act that would extinguish her future. In truth, the cottage was like a bed and breakfast, a place you might book for the weekend, as it was so perfectly presented, with no personal details to tell you much about the previous occupant. Freya found she wanted to know all about Tina Crosscrow and why she'd taken her own life. But if she was looking for answers, she wasn't going to find them here in the cottage. Freya found that the pantry was not well stocked. It contained some bags of pasta, packets of cereal, long-life milk, a few random tins of tomatoes and tuna. She managed to make herself a mug of coffee and poured herself a bowl of cereal, which she ate hungrily. She decided she would not be sleeping in Tina Crosscrow's king-size bed tonight until she'd managed to change all the sheets. She found a sleeping bag in the linen cupboard and lay back on the couch in the living room. The smell of death and decay lingered around her. All she concerned herself with now was getting a good night's sleep. Later on in the night she woke up with a start. She'd heard a strange noise. What was that? A slight banging sound. What the hell was that? Freya felt her whole body freeze over as she listened again, but she heard nothing. The cottage was steeped in an uncongenial, formidable, bodeful darkness. She couldn't see a thing. Everything was blacker than black, so much so that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. She had gone to sleep on the couch, with the lamps on in the living room, and now they were both off. Had there been a power failure, would she need to check the fuse box? All of a sudden, she had this ominous, dreadful feeling that she was not alone, that something or someone was watching her, that someone was in the room with her. She could feel a tangible presence, which made her entire body prickle in trepidation, and her heart seemed to be booming violently in her chest. "Hello? Hello, is anybody there? Is anybody there? Is anyone there?" she called out. And then suddenly something thrashed itself against her feet, and Freya screamed. It was only then she realized that the thing rubbing itself against her legs was a black and white cat. "Where did you come from?" said Freya fondly, picking up the affectionate cat in her arms, stroking it tenderly. "You gave me quite the shock, you did. Oh, you really did. Where did you come from?" The cat was purring and rubbing itself contentedly against Freya, as if it had known her all its life. "Now let me get some light on in here before I have a heart attack," said Freya, feeling around for the light switch. Freya was surprised to see there had been no power failure at all. How could the lamps switch off on their very own like that? It was more than a little weird. The next few days had gone swimmingly for Freya, better than she could have ever expected. She had settled into the cottage like a duck to water, as if she'd always belonged here. There was no doubt that Tina Crosscrow had eclectic, very good taste, and the higgledy-piggledy mix of furniture married together into the house beautifully, with sumptuous rugs and twee curtains. Sweepy Cottage was exactly how Freya envisaged a cottage should be, reminding her of some of the old cottages she had once seen on a visit to Ireland with her parents when she was in her teens. The cottage boasted large bricked fireplaces and a wood-burning stove. There was even a fireplace in the main bedroom. Freya loved the old-fashioned kitchen, with its yellow walls, its white wooden kitchen units, its flagstone floor, and its old-fashioned dresser with its elegant display of blue and white Wedgwood china, along with a large wooden kitchen table that could fit over 10 people. The obnoxious smell had been dealt with, and she could finally breathe again. She couldn't fathom how that dead raccoon had managed to get into the cottage and end up in the kitchen sink, but thankfully the problem had been sorted.
Freya's sister Rainey had been furious with her, just marching out of their lives in the way she did. "I was so worried about you, Freya. I mean, yes, it was nice to get the fruit and the bouquet of flowers. Very thoughtful it was, and thank you for that. But you wouldn't even answer your cell phone. I thought something dreadful had happened to you. Why did you bog off like that? Just leaving a note." Freya had deliberately not answered her cell phone messages from her sister. It had been so upsetting to hear the couple talk about her the other night, and the way her brother-in-law wanted to kick her out of their home had left her feeling rather wounded. "Freya, are you listening to me?" came her sister's voice. "I was worried the hell about you. But I heard your argument the other night with Thornton, Rainey. I know you didn't want me around, so I'm out of your hair. Why are you complaining? You don't have to worry about me now. For your information, I've got a roof over my head, some money in the bank to tide me over, and I'm going to look for a job. I'll be fine. I promise you that." She could hear her sister chewing her lips. "We both know that's not true, Freya. Please don't be like this." "All right, I admit Thornton does want you to leave sooner or later, but we both want you to get your life on track." "My life is on track, Rainey. I'll be in touch shortly. I'm sorry. I'm still upset. I'll call you when I'm not feeling so peaked." And with that, she had abruptly ended the call, hearing her sister protesting down the phone. Freya, please, don't be like that." Freya's account. My whole life had taken a spin, in a positive direction for a change, to such an extent that I was thrown off course. In truth, I was trying to acclimatise to my change of fortune, which was like being flung from the insufferable perishing heat of a scorching desert to the ice-cold winter freeze of the Antarctic. It was exhausting. In other words, my dramatic, unexpected change of circumstances was an incredible shock, even if it was a good one. Indeed, it was so surreal for me that I was convinced I was caught up in an illusory dream from which I did not want to awaken. I was so used to my life being a perennial struggle, fighting to make ends meet, from one month to the next, that I really didn't see change coming my way, even when it hit me across the face like a cold slap. It takes a long while to adjust to things, and for me personally, I was trying to go with the flow. Like a fish that had been swimming downstream for so long, I was not sure exactly how to turn around and swim in the opposite direction. I was so used to drowning and fighting so much to stop myself from being submerged by life's challenges. I could not believe a random chance encounter with a girl outside a bar, who was even more wretched than I was, would facilitate all this serendipitous change for me. I could see Tina Crosscrow was in turmoil from the very first time I laid eyes on her. She had stood there in her skin-coloured dress on a cold night, looking so dreadfully lost. It was only so sad that my good fortune came out of such tragedy. I was upset that Sweet Pea Cottage gave no hint of why Tina Crosscrow had chosen to take her life. I suspected all such evidence had been binned and discarded by Tina herself before she plunged into that lake to her death. Perhaps she wanted to take all her withering secrets down with her to her watery grave. There were 3 residential properties built on this sprawling piece of idyllic prepossessing Georgian countryside, which the residents shared together. One which belonged to Tina Crosscrow's brother, whose name was Zack. Then there was a couple called Sheila and Ernest Partridge, who owned the main house on the property. I was hoping a meeting with Zack might shed more light on why Tina Crosscrow had so much pain in her life, but I was not sure that Zack would take very kindly to my obtrusive interfering presence on the property, as after all, surely he'd have wanted his sister Tina to leave the cottage to him, not just a random stranger like myself that she'd met outside a bar. I was to discover that not only had I inherited a very sweet little cottage, but also a very old Range Rover car that had seen better days, but still worked reasonably well. I could shop and be on the lookout for any potential jobs that were on offer in the local town. I was hoping moving out here would be a brand new beginning for me, with the potential to make new friends, although I wasn't sure the houses sharing the land with me would extend the hand of friendship towards me. I had decided on the 3rd day to take a long leisurely stroll around the property that stretched out forever like a large all-encompassing yawn, as my inquisitiveness had finally got the better of me. I wanted to see White Swan Cottage where Zack Crosscrow lived, and of course the main house, which was a hunting lodge that could host over 15 guests at a time, that belonged to the Partridges. The Partridges had been good friends with the Crosscrow family, so Tina and Zack had sold the hunting lodge to them, which had seemed like a good idea at the time, as the beautiful land offered hunting and fishing opportunities for the residents and their guests to enjoy. I clandestinely decided to walk through the wood grove that fringed one side of the road that lightly led up to the hunting lodge and the cottage where Zack Crosscrow now resided. It turned out I wasn't wrong about that. Furthermore, there were fabulous trails through the trees that were in great condition and looked to be well maintained. I spotted a couple of hunting stands in the trees. Sweet Pea Cottage was the cottage at the bottom part of the property closest to the main road. I did know sooner or later I would need to introduce myself to the residents living here, but I felt reluctantly bashful about doing so. I felt that I shouldn't really be here, as if in some way I was an imposter, and the people on this property would likely feel the same way about me. I mean, who inherits a property from a random stranger? It was a beautiful, prepossessing day. Spring was long behind us. The weather was pleasantly warm. The trees were covered in a rich bounty of leaves, but there was just enough light trespassing through their boughs to prettily light up the trail. My walking boots grazed the ground with a smacking sound as my rubber soles pulverized the leaf litter and random twigs beneath my feet. I could hear the pretty bird song up in the trees. I spotted 2 squirrels friskily bounding up the branches of a tree, always staring at me curiously through very dark eyes. I also encountered a mother doe and her speckled pretty fawn, standing stoically under a tree, staring at me. And then they suddenly charged, like 2 rockets taking off to the moon. All of a sudden, as I began to walk, I was sure I was not alone. I felt absolutely certain something or someone was trailing behind me. But as I turned around, nothing was there. I scrutinized the trees, my eyes looking for any shadowy movement, but there was nothing. I continued to walk, and then I was hit by a shower of pebbles. Someone was definitely there. Someone had thrown the pebbles at me, and I could have sworn I heard a muted chuckle of some kind. "Who is there?" I called out. "Who is there? This isn't funny. Show yourself. I know you're there." I was beginning to suspect the Partridges might have children, and one of them was baiting me. But as I scrutinized the trees, I still saw nothing. I was completely befuddled. I turned around to proceed on my way, and I was showered again by a spray of still more pebbles, and then I heard the muted chuckle again, as if somebody was finding this terribly funny. I was sure it was a kid, so I ran through the trees, bluffing that I'd actually seen the kids, so that I could catch them. It worked like a treat, but it was not a child or any children that I saw, but a tall, shadowy, rather ambiguous being, covered in hair, charging away. And in that moment, I was quite sure I'd seen a Bigfoot. I was trying to make sense of what I'd seen, when a hand patted me on my back, and I let out a loud scream. I turned around, expecting to see another Bigfoot, like the creature I believe I'd only just seen moments before. But instead I was seeing a woman wearing brown leggings and walking boots, looking decidedly peaked. I guess she was in her 50s. She was carrying a hunting rifle in her hand and looked at me through furiously enraged eyes. "Who are you?" she demanded brusquely, her tone snappy and intolerant. "What are you doing here? You do realize that this is private property. We prosecute all trespassers on our land. You've got some explaining to do, young lady. Why are you on this property?" She scrutinized me through narrowing eyes, as if studying a lower form of pond life that needed prompt extinguishing. I trembled rather awkwardly in my boots, my face reddening. "I live here. I'm the new owner of Sweet Pea Cottage. I've just been taking a casual walk in the woods. I do understand the land is shared by all the properties here." The woman's face immediately relaxed. She gave me an apologetic smile. "Oh, my dear, you must please forgive me. We've had issues of late with poachers, you see, and I don't take kindly to seeing strangers on the premises. You can never be too careful, can you? My name is Sheila Partridge. It's very good to meet you. she said, extending her hand to shake mine. I self-consciously took her hand, noticing that she gave me a rather hard squeeze that almost hurt. I privately winced, retracting my hand quickly, wondering if she shook everyone's hand like this. I live at the hunting lodge. We bought the house from the Crosscrow children after their parents died. We have hunting parties up here in season, you know. We often host over 15 guests at a time. I imagine you're planning to sell Sweet Pea Cottage, am I right? Just so you know, I'm an estate agent. I run the estate agents in town. I can give you a valuation if you like for the property. I could see the woman studying me through her dark eyes, looking hopeful, although she tried to hide it well. That's not necessary, I said. It's very kind of you to offer, but I'm not intending to sell the Sweet Pea Cottage. I could swear Sheila Partridge's face almost dropped with disappointment, but then her face suddenly puckered up into a warm smile, and I wondered if I'd imagined the deflated look. But I was sure I hadn't. Well, I hope you don't think I'm very rude, my dear. I'm not sure, though, you will want to stay at Sweet Pea Cottage when you learn the truth about the place, she said, her voice lowering into a warning whisper. But why? I asked. Oh, I will tell you all about it, dear, later on. Why don't you come to my house for dinner tonight, and all will be revealed. I would love my husband and my teenage son to meet you. It's important that as neighbours we get to know each other better. I mean, if you stumble across my husband, you don't want him accusing you of trespassing, do you? Tell me, dear, is there anything you cannot eat? You're not allergic to nuts, are you? No, I can eat anything. Oh, that is such a relief. Now, where's that damn dog of mine? She said, scanning the trees. You came here with a dog, I asked, surprised. I'm afraid so, but he never does what he's told. Benji, where the hell are you? Where is that bloody dog of mine? Soon a black Labrador came friskily charging through the trees. He looked mischievous, and there was something in his mouth. Sheila groaned. Every time we come into the woodgrove it's like this. He finds something disgusting. Drop it now, Benji. Do you hear me? Drop it now, she commanded. Benji stared at her through pleading dark eyes, as if begging his owner to change her mind. Sheila's voice became more demanding. Drop it, Benji, now! You hear me? The dog immediately dropped a rabbit head at her feet, looking up at her with obsequious eyes. Sheila Partridge let out a grievous sigh. That is revolting, Benji! Absolutely revolting! Why do you look so pleased with yourself? Where do you get these revolting things from? Last time it was a squirrel's tail. The time before a dead raccoon. She pulled a plastic poop bag from her sleeveless jacket, and using a plastic glove like a seasoned professional, she slipped it on her fingers and then put the rabbit head in the bag, tying it up into a tight knot. Benji looked bitterly disappointed. I'm so sorry that you had to see that, dear, she said apologetically. Well, it's very good to meet you. What is your name? You must forgive me, I forgot to ask. I'm Freya, I said. It's so good to meet you, Freya. Dinner tonight at 7, don't forget. I'll see you up at the house. And with that she turned away, not even looking back once, with her dog running at her side, his tail wagging, his nose pinned to the ground. I casually ambled through the woods, walking straight back to Sweet Pea Cottage, kicking up the dirt with my rubber soles, lost in my thoughts. I was wondering if I'd really seen a Bigfoot a moment before or not. Had my imagination been playing tricks on me? It's easy to doubt and second-guess yourself when you've seen something so outlandishly vague. I thought about my chance encounter with Sheila Partridge, who had given me the shock of my life when she had pounced on me, so unexpectedly, at the most inopportune moment. I recall how eager she'd looked at the thought of selling Sweet Pea Cottage on my behalf, and now she was saying she was sure I'd sell it if I knew the truth about the place. What was she talking about? She said all would be revealed tonight over dinner. I was glad to be going to dinner at the hunting lodge. It would be nice to get to know my immediate neighbours. But it was quite presumptuous of Sheila Partridge to assume I would be available for dinner. What could she possibly want to tell me about Sweet Pea Cottage that would make me want to sell? I had already developed a fondness for the place, and imagined making a life for myself here, and I really did not need Sheila Partridge throwing a spanner into the works to sabotage my dreams. I arrived for dinner that night at about 7 o'clock. I didn't drive to the property, but took a brisk walk there, carrying a torch in my purse, for the return journey home. I didn't dress up, but wore casual clothes, a pair of black pants and a cream cotton blouse, which, although casual, at least gave the impression I'd made some kind of an effort. The weather was warm. Sometimes the unkind summers can be scorchingly hot here, but the evening breeze was quite cool, and the walk to the lodge house was pleasant. There were 2 forks in the road, one with a sign that read White Swan Cottage, and the other sign straight ahead with an arrow, pointed to the hunting lodge. So I followed the road until I came to a sizable stone and wood property, which I knew at once was the lodge. It was Sheila who opened the door to me, whisking me into her house, where I could smell the roasted chicken in the air, and my stomach began to growl. The smell was incredibly good. "Oh, it is so lovely to see you, dear. I'm so glad you could come," said Sheila, brushing my cheek with a kiss. "Now I need to introduce you to the rest of my family." Sheila's husband, Angus Partridge, was rather a reticent, unassuming man. He seemed friendly enough as he greeted me. "Good to meet you, Freya. You gave my wife quite a shock today, you did, when she ran into you in the wood grove. She was really surprised to find that you were the new occupant of Sweet Pea Cottage. Welcome. It is very good to meet you. You must have been very close to Tina Crosscrow to inherit her cottage. She loved that place, you know." "I wasn't really close to her," I said. "It's a long story." "I look forward to hearing all about it over dinner. This is my son, Monty. Monty, get over here, will you? Freya would like to meet you. I'm afraid he's a lot like me, not much of a talker. But my wife Sheila makes up for all our shortcomings in the talking department," he said, giving me a wink. "That wife of mine can talk the skin off a horse if given the chance. No wonder she's an estate agent." Monty gave me a withered look through his brown eyes. He had a long face much like his father, and similar hooded deep-set eyes, along with a rather distinguished Roman nose. He wore his dark hair spunked up with a ton of hair gel, in a punk rock hairstyle, as if trying to be trendy. "It's nice to meet you, Freya," he said, taking a seat at the table. "Well, it's very nice to meet you all too, and thank you very much for inviting me for dinner tonight. Something smells incredibly good. Is it chicken we're having?" "Clever girl, you've got a very good nose on you. Yes, we are having chicken for dinner. I do hope you like roast chicken and all the trimmings, Freya. I always feel chicken is a safe option to serve your guests. I find some people are not partial to eating too much red meat these days. This is free-range chicken, which is far superior, of course. I can't stand the stuff you buy at the store." "It smells delicious. I love chicken, Sheila. You made a good decision there." Sheila loaded up my plate with chicken, gravy and roasted vegetables and handed it to me. "Do tuck in, Freya, before it gets cold. Dreadful heartbreaking business, isn't it, with what happened to poor Tina? And, oh, what a lovely girl she was, too. I mean, we knew that Tina Crosscrow was going through stuff. But to take her life like that, it was desperately tragic. But maybe her past came back to haunt her. Some things, well, they just can't be forgotten, can they?" "Do you know why she took her life?" I asked gingerly, my eyes pinned on Sheila. Sheila sat down opposite me and reached over to fill my glass with wine, and then she topped hers up. Sheila was quiet for a moment while she took a sip of her wine. "Tina was a very mixed-up girl, Freya. I don't know if you know that she and her brother Zack were adopted when they were very young by the Crosscrows, who were old at the time. The Crosscrows couldn't have any children of their own, and were sure that Tina and Zack could have a good life with them. I think the kids were about 4 and 5 years old when they were adopted by the Crosscrows, who were very good people, you know.
but it is how they came to be adopted, where the tragedy really begins."
"How do you mean?" I asked, hurriedly swallowing my chicken and knocking it back with a swig of wine.
"So I take it you don't know the story then, Freya? How do I put this delicately? Tina Crosscrow's real birth mother was shot at point-blank range by a very jealous boy. Those kids were tiny at the time and were found 40 hours later covered in blood. They'd been trying to wake their mother up. They had been eyewitness to the brutal murder of their mother. I mean, how do you ever get over something like that? It's probably seared in your memory like an indelible tattoo. Both kids were adopted by the Crosscrows, who were old enough to be their great-grandparents, you know, which is why they built their kids' cottages on the property, so that they could always sell the main house if they wanted to. We knew the Crosscrow family well. My husband was keen to buy the hunting lodge from them, weren't you, dear? Angus is a very skilled hunter, teaches people how to hunt. We were the ones that bought the hunting lodge for that very reason. It's not my kind of thing, of course. Never understood the fascination of hunting myself. I'm a city girl, you see, through and through. Always preferred the finer things in life. Tragically, Tina and Zach's real father died in a motorbike accident a year after Tina was born. So it seems tragedy ensnared itself around that poor family, for reasons I can't explain. After their real birth mother's fortuitous murder, the kids were adopted by the Crosscrows and were doing incredibly well. Even though the Crosscrows were old, they were legally able to adopt the children because Mrs. Crosscrow was a renowned child psychologist who knew how to deal with traumatized children. So the social services thought the kids were in the very best hands, as Mrs. Crosscrow worked wonders with them. In the beginning, they hid for days and days in a closet, refusing to come out. But Mrs. Crosscrow transformed them. She really did. What a remarkable woman she was. She worked wonders on those kids. They were like regular kids, happy-go-lucky, without a trouble in the world. The Crosscrows thought the kids had no memory of the tragic event from their past. But when Tina suddenly became a teenager, I think she was about 18 years old, she began to have the most horrifying flashbacks. Dreadful they were. They were so tormenting that her whole life spiraled out of control. She attempted suicide a couple of times after she'd had nightmares that involved blood and being stabbed to death. She was treated for post-traumatic stress, and for a while she was doing very well. Other experts were involved in her therapy, but it was useless as Tina Crosscrow was tormented day and night by these brutal visions that just would not abate, and no one seemed able to help her. It was too dreadful for words.
"That is awful," I said. "So you think that is why she killed herself?"
"Oh, absolutely. There is no doubt about it," said Sheila. "Zach was older by a year, you know. But he's level-headed and very pragmatic, you know. And I think he's not allowed the past to affect his current life. But he's very broken up about Tina's death. They were very close, you know. He's devastated. He's going to sell the White Swan cottage. Well, put it more bluntly, I'm going to sell it for him. He's going to move away to finally put the past behind him, which I think is a jolly good idea in the circumstances. But let's change the subject, shall we, dear? It's dreadful to talk about all this macabre stuff, but I think you should know the truth about Tina, given she left you the Sweet Pea Cottage. I think she'd want you to know her story."
"I'm so grateful you told me, Sheila. Thank you very much. Everything makes much more sense to me now. I understand why she looked so lost, as if she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders."
"That's a very good way to put it, my dear. I couldn't have said it better myself."
The subject over the dinner table cheated on to other things, and it was over the dessert of pears and red wine, served with clotted cream, that Sheila broached the subject of Sweet Pea Cottage. And when she did, everything became painfully quiet around the table, and it seemed that both Angus and Monty avoided any eye contact with me, as if they were uncomfortable with the subject being discussed.
"As you know, I run the local estate agents in town, dear, and I can sell Sweet Pea Cottage for you very easily, without any problems. I can get it off your hands in a heartbeat. I think I know someone who would be eager to purchase the place from you, and I'm quite sure they would give you a reasonable price. I mean, why would you want to keep a place that, given the tragic circumstances connected to the property, I'm sure you'd wisely want to put that all behind you?
But if the truth be told, I don't want to sell Sweet Pea Cottage. I really like the place. I'm becoming quite attached to it, actually. Tina left it to me in her will, you know, and I remember her last words were to me, "Keep it if you can bear to." She was talking about Sweet Pea Cottage. It meant so much to her, obviously. And after everything you've told me, I feel indebted to her to keep the place.
How well did you know Tina Crosscrow? Asked Angus curiously, taking a bite of his pear.
I didn't know her at all. It was a chance encounter outside a bar. Tina's purse was regretfully snatched by a stranger, so I paid for her to get safely home by taxi. She took down my details and then left the cottage to me in her will. I was very shocked. She left me a note with her solicitors saying she wanted to do something good, and leaving the cottage to me seemed like a good idea. At this startling revelation, Sheila almost choked over her pear, and both Angus and Zack stared at me through wide eyes.
So Tina didn't even know you, dear? Asked Sheila. My word! Didn't I say that girl was strange? What a bizarre thing to do, to leave your cottage to a perfect stranger. You would have thought she'd leave the place to her brother Zack. What an odd thing to do. Still, she said, shaking her head of grey curls vigorously, I'm sure, knowing what you know now, in the circumstances, you'll likely want to part with the cottage, and no one can judge you for that. It's perfectly understandable. I can give you a valuation in the morning, if you like, and get you the swift sale you're obviously looking for.
But I'm not selling, I said abruptly. I like the place, and even though I only met Tina briefly, we connected, you know. And after what you've told me, I think it's even more important to keep the cottage. She really wanted me to have it, and in the circumstances, I really want to keep it. It's a delightful cottage. It would be such a pity to sell it.
Well, you're a lot braver than I am, dear. You wouldn't catch me living in that house, especially given the place is haunted. Sweetheart, said Angus under his breath, must we go there? Is it really necessary to scare Freya like this?
The man almost growled at his wife contemptuously.
Oh, Angus, for goodness sake! I think that Freya deserves to know the truth, don't you? I'm quite sure you don't want to live in a haunted property, do you, dear? But don't you worry about it. When we sell the place for you, I won't mention this very delicate fact to buyers, because you wouldn't want them to be put off buying the place, would you? If people glean a place is haunted, the value sadly plummets quite considerably. But I can assure you a swift sale, and a very good price to boot. You will not be disappointed, my girl. But you heard the girl, Sheila. She doesn't want to sell the place, said Angus. I think you should respect her decision. Oh, Angus, do please shut up, will you? You have no idea what you're talking about, said Sheila friskily. I'm trying to do Freya a big favour.
I was appalled by how eager Sheila Partridge was to sell my newly acquired property, and now she was claiming the place was haunted, and I wasn't sure this was true, although I did remember the lights going on and off in the living room on my first night at the cottage. Why did the woman want to sell Tina's cottage so much? Was she desperate for a big fat commission cheque? Surely not. The Partridges seemed wealthy enough. I wondered if Sheila had a friend or family member, perhaps, that she wanted to sell the cottage to, so that they could be close neighbours. That would make sense, I thought. I was in her way, and she wanted me out. She could sell the place to a friend. I suddenly felt very uncomfortable, and was certainly not going to succumb to the silent pressure that Sheila had indiscriminately subjected me to. I think I better go, I said. Thank you very much for the lovely meal. The chicken was absolutely delicious, and the pears were gorgeous. "It was good to meet you all," I said. "Don't you want a lift to the cottage, dear?" asked Sheila. "I'm quite sure Angus would happily give you one." "No, it's fine. I really don't need a lift." "I'd be delighted to take you. It would be my pleasure." "No, really, it's not necessary. Anyway, I fancy walking home. I've got a torch with me." I hasten to say I was heartily relieved to get the hell out of the hunting lodge. The charming home and pleasant evening had been somewhat spoiled by Sheila's cursory remarks about Sweet Pea Cottage. Still, going there for dinner had not been completely redundant. I had learnt a great deal about Tina Crosscrow and why she had chosen to take her own life. It all made perfect sense to me now. It would seem even from a very young age, the experiences from our early lives shape us into who we will one day become. But Tina Crosscrow could not shake off the bitter pain of her past, and was haunted by the indelible memories of her mother's murder, and the only way those blistering memories from the past would heal was if she took herself out of this reality. She saw death as her ultimate escape. I sensed that Sheila formidably ruled the roost in her household at the hunting lodge, with an iron fist, of course. I felt sorry for her husband Angus and her son, being subjected to her dictatorial abuse. I sensed in Sheila Partridge's household it was her way or the highway. I felt pity for anyone who worked with her in that estate agent's office in town. Did anyone dare say no to the woman? Well, she'd met her match with me. I had absolutely no intention of buckling or folding under the pressure and selling Sweet Pea Cottage. That was not going to happen. In a bizarre, rather curious way, I felt now an even greater connection with Tina Crosscrow, as I now understood why she wanted out. Angus Partridge had not been happy when Sheila suddenly began to tell me that my cottage was haunted. Was this a cunning tactic on her part to turf me out of my cottage? Well, it wasn't going to work, I thought angrily. My boots kicked the ground as I ambled back to Sweet Pea Cottage, reflecting over the strange events of the evening. The night was inauspiciously dark, as the pearly moon had discreetly hidden herself behind some murky cloud cover, while the bright stars of the firmament were lost behind this tenebrific veil. I could hear the sounds of crickets and frogs. I glanced towards the ambiguous silhouettes of the trees, and that was when I was sure I'd seen a movement of some kind, along with a pair of bright yellow eyes staring at me at 8 feet off the ground, peering at me clandestinely from behind a tree. I immediately flashed my torchlight towards the tree in question. Earlier on in the day I thought I'd seen a Bigfoot when Sheila Partridge had pounced on me unexpectedly, but I had convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But those yellow eyes staring at me, well, had I imagined them too? I persuaded myself that I couldn't have seen anything, and was heartily relieved when I finally entered the cottage. The door of my cottage swung open. I couldn't understand it. I had locked the door. I was sure I had. So why was it open? Was I going completely mad? When I opened the cottage and entered the kitchen, a bin bag from the bin was strewn haphazardly over the floor, as if it had been tampered with by a raccoon. There was a milk carton and a couple of ready meals spilled over on their side, and an empty pizza box with its crusts all crumbled across the floor. It was a mess. I saw no sign of an opportunistic raccoon, so I simply cleared up the mess and replaced everything back in the bin. I retired to bed and woke up with a start in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard a sound. What the hell was that? The black and white cat I decided to call Tipples, who seemed to have adopted me as his new owner, was lying curled up on me in a ball, and seemed oblivious to any noises I was hearing. But his presence on my bed comforted me, making me feel not quite so alone. I was absolutely certain I'd heard something. It sounded like people were in my house, having an argument together. I could hear a voice saying, "I'm going to kill you, and no one will ever find your body. There'll be no evidence." This was followed by a menacious laugh. Then I heard a woman pleading, "Please, please be reasonable, Russell. It meant absolutely nothing, absolutely nothing." The man was screaming again, "I'll kill you, I'll kill you. No one humiliates me like this. Do you hear me?" What the hell, I thought. They're people in my house, engaged in a threatening argument. I quickly scurried out of my bed and scurried towards the sound of the strange voices that, to my horror, were coming from the television set in the living room. It was on. The voices had come from the TV. A man was telling a woman in graphic detail how he intended to dispose of her body. I stood in the living room nonplussed, not knowing whether to be relieved or not. At least no one was in the cottage. But how could the television have switched itself on like that? I switched the television off and promptly returned to bed, and a while later I heard a banging sound of someone knocking at the front door. This was not a friendly knock. It was a kind of violent, furious, angry knock that suggested someone wanted to break down the front door, and once inside, possibly tear me apart, limb from limb. I could almost envisage the headlines the following morning. Woman found lying dead in cottage. I cannot recall a time when I felt more afraid. The banging stopped and continued again. Someone was pounding the door and scaring the hell out of me. It was almost like they'd stop at absolutely nothing to break down the door. I thought to call for help, but my cell phone was drained of energy. I didn't understand why. I was so sure I'd charged it. I could hear a whimpering sound, which I thought came from the cat, but I realized it was coming from me. My heart was thundering violently in my chest, my skin was prickling with anxiety, my throat was congealed with a bitter trepidation, as I clambered as quietly as I could to the front door, retrieving a fire poker in my hand as a weapon of defence. I tiptoed cautiously to the front door with a fire poker in my hand to use as a weapon of defence, and like a frightened rabbit, I called out in a nervous voice, "Is anybody there? Is anybody there?" But there was no response, so I cautiously opened the door to be met by cool gasps of air. I stood in the doorway looking bemused, and that was when I noticed in the distance yellow eyes staring at me from a tree at about 8 foot off the ground. I got a glimpse of what I believed was a bullet-shaped head. It freaked me the hell out, and I hurriedly closed the door behind me. What the hell was going on, I wondered? Was there a possibility that Sweet Pea Cottage was actually haunted after all, and that Sheila Partridge's warnings had not just been pie in the sky, but had been true? And what about those menacious yellow eyes staring at me from the woods? Whatever and whoever it was that kept watching me scared the bejesus out of me, Bigfoot or not. I returned to bed and managed to get a good night's sleep. It must have been about 9 o'clock in the morning when I heard a knock at the door. Luckily it was not the kind of ominous knock, I want to kill you kind of knock, that I experienced the previous night. "Who's there?" I called, just to be sure that the person on the other side of the door was not a potential murderer. "It's Zack Crosscrow," came a male voice. "I believe you were a friend of my sister Tina's. I popped over to say hello, that's all. Introduce myself." I opened the door to a very good-looking young man, who was about my age, with dark hair and green eyes that looked clouded with a sorrowful melancholia. "Hello, would you like to come in?" "Not really," said the young man. "I'd rather not, if you don't mind. Too many memories for me here. How about we go back to my place and have a coffee there? I'd really like to talk, if that's not an awful imposition to you. I miss my sister Tina dreadfully, you know. I came here in my Range Rover. I'll drive you to my cottage. We can talk there, if we may." "But of course," I said, following him to his truck and climbing in beside him on the passenger seat. Before long I found myself sitting in the White Swan, a cottage not dissimilar to the Sweet Pea. "How do you like your coffee?" asked Zack, who had one of those fancy coffee machines. "I'll have the same as you," I said. "I'm not fussy." "Do you know that's exactly what Tina would have said," he said, giving me a shy smile and handing me a mug of coffee, graced by a frothy foam on the top. "In a strange way, you rather remind me of her, as odd as that may sound." "Thanks," I said. "That's a compliment. Your sister was very beautiful. By the way, this is excellent coffee, as good as you get in a coffee shop." "Well, I try," said Zack with a chuckle. "The secret is in the beans, you know. That's what makes the best coffee, I find. So tell me, how do you know Tina?
Well, I mean, how did you know her? You must have been close. She left you her pride and joy, you know. She rarely loved Sweet Pea Cottage very much.
I'm afraid this may come as a bit of a surprise to you, but I didn't know her well at all.
But I don't understand, said Zack, looking confused.
It's a bizarre story. It really is. I don't even know how to start. I was in a bar in downtown Atlanta, you see. I came out of the bar, and there your sister was. She was wearing a flesh-coloured dress that clung to her figure so tightly that I thought she was actually naked, which gave me quite a shock. She actually looked like a ghost, but a beautiful one at that. But in the same breath, she looked lugubriously sorrowful. It was a cold night, and I walked over to her to ask her if she was all right. She told me that her purse had been snatched, and I told her I'd pay for her to have a lift home. She was incredibly grateful, and insisted on taking my details down. There was a strange connection between us from the very beginning, like two kindred spirits, if you know what I mean.
No, what do you mean?
I shrugged awkwardly. Well, I've made several cock-ups with my life, you know, and I guess I found myself in a rock-bottom place. She recognised that in me, and I recognised that in her, I suppose.
I see, said Zack gingerly, his eyes studying me curiously. Go on.
Well, the next thing I know was I was called over to the solicitor's office, and Tina had written me a letter, bequeathing the cottage to me in a note. You can read it if you like, I said, opening my purse, and handing the letter over to Zack, who read it curiously and laughed as he handed the letter back to me.
Oh, this is hilarious. Only Tina would do something like that. That's why I loved my sister so much. She was so idiosyncratic, so original. Oh, I miss her so much, you know.
You're not mad she left the cottage to me, then?
Of course I'm not mad, said Zack. Why would I be? My sister is perfectly entitled to do what she wants with her cottage. She left me all her money and gave you her stuff. Besides, why would I want her cottage? I'd only sell it. You heard what she said in her letter. I think it gave her a measure of peace to think she could make a difference in somebody else's life. You gave her that gift before she died. You made her feel she could exit this life doing something good for somebody else, and that meant a whole lot to her, I'm sure. She was a troubled soul, you know. I'm only older than her by a year, but my sister's turbulent life was an ongoing merry-go-round. One moment she was happy, the next desperately sad, and when she was like that, there was nothing anyone could do to lift her out of her melancholia. She went to specialists and was put on all kinds of medication, but nothing ever worked. The meds only made her feel numb, as if her mind was anaesthetized, and she didn't like that feeling, so she threw those tablets down the toilet and sought after alternative treatments, like 5-HTP and stuff like that, but nothing worked. My sister was so hurt deep inside, like a bad seed in an apple. It's quite tough to extract the rot, isn't it, without damaging the whole apple.
That's a good way to put it, I said. I went to dinner with the Partridges, you know. They told me the whole story. I'm so sorry for what happened to you and your sister when you were young. I just can't imagine. It's too dreadful for words.
Zack raised his hand in a stop sign. There is really no need to feel sorry for me, Freya, or for my late sister. It is what it is. A script in our lives that simply cannot be unwritten. We all have pages in our lives we would like to tear out, scripts we would like to toss away in the trash. But once an event has played out in our lives, it's too late to stop. It's been written. It's permanent. It's how you react to the script which helps you navigate your way forward, I suspect. I'm glad the Partridges told you about what happened to us as kids. Given my sister left you the cottage, I believe she'd want you to know our story. The Partridges knew my parents, which is why me and my sister sold them the lodge. I regret that decision, but it's too late now. In hindsight, my sister and I should have lived at the hunting lodge and rented out the cottages. But that woman, Sheila Partridge, can be very persuasive, you know, so we agreed to sell her the lodge. She runs her own estate agents in town and is quite ruthless in getting what she wants. It's her husband and son I feel sorry for. I suspect she bullies them relentlessly.
That's the impression I got last night. I went to have dinner with them last night, the Partridge family, I mean. I didn't warm to Sheila at all.
I don't particularly like her very much myself. Sheila managed to talk me around to selling the White Swan. She says she's got a great buyer for this place who will give me a good price. Maybe she's right, and that I do need to put the past behind me, and a new start is what I need. In truth, I'm not champing at the bit to sell this place. It feels like my last connection to Tina. We've spent some good times here on this property, you know. This is the place where we grew up as children. Our adopted parents gave us both great lives.
Well, then you shouldn't sell. Don't let that woman force you to do anything you don't want. I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you haunted by your mother's death? I mean your real mother's death, like your sister was?
No, I'm not. Of course it's affected me. How can it not? Any challenge we face in our lives that hurts is going to leave behind an indelible imprint. But those scars you don't physically see. I'm lucky because I have no memory of that childhood event, even though I was older than Tina at the time. I was told by my psychologist that I've blocked it out of my mind and abolished the memory, as my way of moving forward with my life. There are some people that can do that with a degree of success, you know. It's a coping mechanism, I suspect. Some soldiers that fought in Vietnam literally blocked traumatic memories out of their minds with what is known as voluntary amnesia. In other words, they have willfully expunged those memories in order to cope with their lives. For me, I have no memory of my mother or the event, so I'm considerably lucky, I suspect. For Tina, I hasten to say, the memories of my mother lying in a pool of blood after her ex-boyfriend murdered her came flooding back to her in her teens. She'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming. My adopted parents, well, they didn't take it terribly well. Tina received lots of counselling, and things got better for a while, until the nightmares returned, more fiercely than ever before. My adopted mother, Mrs. Crosscrow, found Tina in her bed close to death when she first attempted suicide. She had swallowed hundreds of sleeping pills. It was a miracle she was still alive. She was rushed into hospital. Her stomach was pumped. But a couple of years later, my adopted parents, who were very old at the time, suddenly passed away with heart attacks within mere weeks of each other. I guess the shock of what Tina had attempted doing to herself hit them so hard, their hearts just couldn't take it.
I'm so sorry. I had no idea. It must have been so tough. Why are you in such a hurry to sell your cottage if you don't want to? I'm not going to let Mrs. Partridge bully me into selling Sweet Pea Cottage. She insists it's haunted, you know. Zack began to laugh.
Did I not tell you Sheila Partridge is unscrupulous? See what I mean? That woman will say anything to get you to do her bidding. Of course Sweet Pea Cottage is not haunted. Believe me, I would know all about it if that were the case. I think Sheila Partridge cannot wait to get commission checks for offloading our properties to hungry buyers. I know at the estate agents the people working under her love to hate her.
But are you absolutely sure the cottage isn't haunted? I asked. It's just strange, rather idiosyncratic things have happened there. The television and lights have switched themselves on and off. Last night something was pounding on the door so loudly, I thought they were going to break the door down. And last night when I returned home from dinner with the Partridges, I was absolutely sure I'd locked the front door, but it was unlocked when I returned home, and there was garbage strewn all over my kitchen floor. It was more than a little weird.
Maybe you thought you had locked it, said Zack kindly. And as for electric problems, maybe you should get your electrics checked. And as for the banging at your front door, there was quite a fierce wind blowing last night. In my experience, when the wind is howling, everything can rattle.
You're probably right, I said, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief that my concerns about the cottage were clearly unfounded. Well, it's so good to meet you, Zack. I'll love you and leave you. Thanks for the coffee and for putting my mind at rest. And I'm dreadfully sorry about your loss."
"Thanks," said Zack. "It's tough having lost Tina. But I hope she's found peace where she is. Are you sure you don't want me to give you a lift back to your cottage? It really is no problem."
"I'd actually enjoy the walk back," I said. "The exercise will do me good."
"Don't be a stranger, Freya," said Zack. "You know you can pop in any time you like. I will welcome the visit. It's been incredibly good to meet you. You do remind me of my late sister. A friend of hers is a friend of mine."
"Ditto," I said, giving Zack a friendly nod.
"Why don't you walk through the woods?" said Zack. "It's a nice shortcut to your cottage, if you take the Gregory path. It's clearly marked."
"I might just do that," I said, secretly wondering if walking through the woods was actually a good idea, as I was convinced that when I'd inadvertently bumped into Mrs. Partridge that I'd been stalked by a Bigfoot. But the shadowy figure had been so ambiguous, I wasn't sure what I'd seen, and I would have felt foolish mentioning such thoughts to Zack. But I also had seen those yellow eyes staring at me from the woods, always watching, and I don't mind admitting I had felt very afraid. I decided it would be good to follow the Gregory path through the trees, which I noticed was clearly marked. I was not going to be dictated by my fear. That was no way to live. I was not going to be intimidated by Sheila Partridge, or by what I perceived might be a Bigfoot in the woods. Soon I was on the Gregory path, my mind swimming with all the details that Zack had told me about Tina Crosscrow, and her perennial struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder that finally got too much of a burden for her. "Thank you, Tina," I whispered to myself, "for giving me this brand new start. And don't you worry about Sheila Partridge. She's not going to get her grubby hands on Sweet Pea Cottage." My silent promise was witnessed by the trees, as my heavy boots grazed the earthen floor of the woods, pulverizing the leaf litter beneath my rubber soles like a pestle and mortar. It was such a prepossessing day, and I was glad of this pleasant walk. I was beginning to feel rather invigorated and refreshed, enjoying the warm feeling of the sun filtering through the trees and warming the back of my neck and shoulders, as if an air dryer was blowing over me. It was a pleasant experience, and all the shrubs, fern, and leafy forest fauna were washed in a shimmering golden glaze that was almost ethereal. There was a slight breeze blowing that caused some of the boughs of the trees to dance, as they rustled their leaves like hundreds of lofty cheerleaders shaking their pom-poms. I could hear the bird song high up in the trees, a pretty collection of trills, warbles, and whistles. Then it happened again, the dreadful feeling that I was not alone, and that something was watching me. I felt as if eyes were burrowing in the back of my skull, which sent pinpricks of unease crawling all over my body. Someone was there. I knew they were there. I could feel a powerful presence. I wasn't imagining it. Yet when I looked through the trees, nothing was there. It was so frustrating. I called out through the woods, "Hello! Hello!" And the disembodied, haunting echo of my urgent voice returned right back to me, amidst the silent whispers of the leaves and the trills of the birds. I continued along my way, ever certain that I was being clandestinely stalked, but nothing was ever there. Was I going completely mad? Were Sheila Partridge's ominous suggestions about Sweet Pea Cottage being haunted? Had they woven a powerful thread of self-doubt in my mind that was persuading my scepticism to believe in things that were not really there? I was now envisaging a Bigfoot in the woods, along with ghostly spectres playing with the electrics at the cottage and banging on the front door in the middle of the night obtrusively. I needed to pull in the reins of my fear, as if breaking in an unbridled horse. In my leisurely, pleasant walk back to Sweet Pea Cottage, I could not help finding that I was beginning to feel indignant toward Sheila Partridge for putting all these outlandish thoughts into my head, just so that she could get my cottage off my hands, and a nice commission cheque for the sale. By all accounts, Sheila was piling on the pressure with Zack Crosscrow, trying to persuade him to sell the White Swan as well, when I could see he was very attached to his charming cottage. Zack was right. The woman was unscrupulous, but at this point in time, I was not actually aware of just how unscrupulous she actually was, and the length she was prepared to go to get what she wanted. It was when I reached the edge of the woods and saw the comforting, pleasing silhouette of Sweet Pea Cottage, that I smiled contentedly to myself. It would seem this charming little abode had wormed its way into my heart. I could see why Tina loved it so much. I stood there for a brief moment in the trees, staring at the cottage, almost as if I was viewing it for the very first time, like observing a great work of art and just taking it all in. Its whitewashed walls, cast in the lighted shadows of the late morning, were stunning. The tumble of red climbing roses and purple wisteria, winding its way around the front walls of the house and over the red front door, was absolutely enchanting. It was then that I realized to my astonishment that my front door was ajar. I knew I had locked it. Someone was in my cottage. My blood turned icy cold as I stared at my cottage, not believing what I was witnessing. I fumbled around rather awkwardly in the pocket of my jeans for my cell phone. I needed to call the police at once. Someone had broken into my cottage. Then I remembered that my cell phone was charging on the bureau in my bedroom. Damn! I decided to creep out clandestinely to my cottage, with a piece of timber in my hand, to use as a rather futile weapon of self-defence. I had a burning need to know who was in my cottage and why. As I approached the door very discreetly, I called out loudly, "The police have been called. I've called the police. They're going to be here any moment. Come out now." Of course, it was a barefaced lie. But I wanted to unsettle the intruder. I wanted to know who they were. I wanted to call their bluff. But no one came out of the cottage. I imagine that who had ever been in my property had long since left. At first, Sweet Pea Cottage looked as if it was an apple pie order, but that was misleading, because when I entered the kitchen, I let out a disembodied scream. There was a large pool of blood all over my kitchen floor. It was grotesque. It looked like a crime scene, as if someone had been murdered in my kitchen. There was blood spatter all over the yellow walls, and it looked menaciously macabre, like something out of a horror movie. And all over the floor were black feathers, parts of a bird, the head, the beak, the body. And there, written in blood all over the wall, in horrifying handwriting, were the huge words, "Get out." All of a sudden, the front door was being opened, and I realized the intruder must have hidden in the cottage. They were not going to get away with this, that was for sure. I could see an ambiguous grey figure in a hoodie dashing through the trees, and I quickly gave him chase. I was so furious that my fear had abandoned me. But whoever was running through the trees could move like the wind. I'd never be able to catch up with them, no matter how hard I tried. I'd always been dreadful at sports in school, and my running ability was less than adequate. It was then that I heard a huge discomposing scream, and a young male voice saying, "Please, please put me down, please." I hightailed it into the woods as fast as I possibly could, and that was when I got the shock of my life. Standing there was a huge male Bigfoot. The creature was real. He was easily over 8 foot tall, possibly more, covered in cinnamon-coloured hair. The thing that startled me the most was how human the creature was. His face reminded me of a noble Indian warrior, and there was intelligence that burned like a blazing fire in his maple syrup-coloured eyes. I didn't feel fear, but complete and total and utter intrigue, and a wondrous awe. But what he was doing baffled me the most. In his hands was swinging the beleaguered figure of Monty Partridge, the son of Sheila Partridge. The young teenager looked absolutely terrified, but he was wearing the grey hoodie that I'd seen escaping from my cottage only moments before. I noticed his brown eyes were round with terror. I couldn't blame him. Anyone would be afraid being manhandled by a Bigfoot. I had a profound sense the Bigfoot had no intention of harming him, that he had stopped my intruder on my behalf, so that I could find out who was actually messing with me. "Please, please put me down," cried the young teenager. He was crying. I'm sure it was not the most comfortable feeling in the world to be in the Bigfoot's arms. In truth, I was struck by the fact that Monty Partridge looked like a doll in the Bigfoot's hands, and for a moment I marvelled at what I was seeing. The Bigfoot's voice boomed. He spoke to me in a strange language. "Dampinaqua hasatalakanico
"Hila-tiba! He's trying to scare you," he said to me. "He's broken into your house. I've been watching him. He keeps doing it again and again." I realized to my astonishment that I understood the Bigfoot's words. The Bigfoot threw Monty at my feet in disgust, and I found myself staring down at the teenager. It was clear the Bigfoot was not going anywhere. He stood still like a tall, lofty tree, his eyes permanently pinned on Monty Partridge, as if he knew that this young man had a lot of explaining to do. "It was you!" I shrieked at Monty. "How dare you! You put blood all over my kitchen floor! You scared me last night! You put those words all over the wall, 'Get out in blood!' There's blood spatter all over my kitchen walls! How could you do that to me? Do you have any idea how terrified I was? What kind of a weirdo are you?" I grabbed him by the scruff of his collar and shook him violently. He didn't try to run away, nor did he fight back. I think the sight of the Bigfoot watching him had scared the bejesus out of him. "It was you!" I said again and again. "It was you! I can't believe it! I can't believe it! Everything that I've gone through! The television going on and off! It was you, wasn't it?" Tears were now spilling down my cheeks, but more out of anger and infuriation than of fear any more. I found myself slapping him across the face, but he stood there frozen to the spot and did not answer me for a long while, and then he said, "She made me do it. You don't understand what she's like. I'm not sick in the head, I promise you. It was her. She made me do it." "Who made you do what?" I asked. Please make that Bigfoot go. "He's scaring me," said the teenager. "I can't talk with him around. He's very cross with me." To my amazement, the Bigfoot appeared to understand everything that was going on, and just glided away, leaving both me and Monty in the wood grove. Monty got up onto his feet, shaking away the leaves and forest dirt that clung to his chinos. His face was as white as paper, and his entire body was shaking like a leaf. I think the Bigfoot had given him a dreadful fright. "That Bigfoot, my God, he's enormous. The most scary thing I've ever seen in my whole life. I thought for a moment he was going to kill me, but he was speaking to me in my head, and he told me to stop messing with you. He seems to be protecting you. Remind me never to mess with you again." "Yes, I think he has been watching out for me, for some reason," I said. "He's been stalking me since I moved here. But I think he was just watching over me and wondering why you were messing around with the cottage. You've been toying with me, but why? I need answers, Monty. Nothing is making any sense. Do you get some kind of warped satisfaction out of scaring people? I mean, where is this coming from? I don't understand." "I told you, it's not me. I'm not the one that's sick in the head. It's my mother," said Monty bashfully, unable to hold my inquiring gaze. "My mother Sheila wanted me to scare you. She wants you to think that the cottage is haunted. You have no idea what she's like. My mother won't take no for an answer. It was my mother who got a key made for your cottage, so that I could go in and out at will when you were asleep, and switch on the television and mess with the lights. She made me do it. She was the one that made me put the dead raccoon that our Labrador retrieved in the sink, the one with all the maggots in. She wanted to freak you out when you arrived here, so much so that you would be virtually begging her to sell the place for you. She was the one that insisted I made a bloodbath in your kitchen with pig's blood this morning, while you were at Zach's cottage, after our dog found a dead crow in the woods, so that I'd scatter all the feathers around. I thought you'd be gone for much longer. She made me write all over the walls in pig's blood to get out. She so wants you to believe that cottage is haunted, so you'll be desperate to sell." "Ah, my word! I can't believe she'd do all that. What is wrong with your mother? She's seriously sick in the head. Why is she so desperate for a commission check? It's absolutely insane." Monty laughed. "This is not about commission. It's much more sinister than that. My mother wants to buy both the cottages from you and Zach at a ridiculously cheap price. She is the one that is going to give you the cheap price for your properties. She intended to give you and Zack a low valuation for your cottage, which is illegal, but that's not going to stop the likes of my mother. She wants to sell this land to a property developer, who will give her a vast fortune for this whole place, which would be life-changing for our family. My mother cannot sell the land until she owns the cottages and the lodge, and then it's all hers. She wants to go and live in the Hamptons, in a place not far to where Gwyneth Paltrow lives, and retire there. My mother's fixated on buying a place there, preferably on the land close to Route 27, close to the ocean, in an expensive neighbourhood, south of the highway, I believe. I looked at Monty incredulously. But why would you agree to do this for your mother? You know it's wrong. You could be arrested for this. You do realise that? Monty hung his head in shame. I wish my dad would have the guts to divorce my mother. He should have got rid of her long ago. Both of us are completely under her control. It's pathetic. You have no idea how dominating she is. We both tried to persuade her not to do this. But when my mother wants something, nothing will stop her from achieving her goals. Thanks for telling me all this, Monty. You can go back home. Don't for God's sake breathe a word of this to your mother. Play her at her own game. Tell her that you did everything she wanted. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this information, but I'm going to think about it long and hard. It's our secret, do you understand? For the record, I'm really sorry about everything I've done. I really regret it. I haven't enjoyed any of it. I've found it sick and disgusting, and I really apologise. Monty, your apology is accepted. Your mother put you up to this. This was not your idea. It's her that's got the problem. You can get her arrested for all I care. I've had enough of my mother. But please don't involve me, and don't involve my dad in any of this. We were not party to my mother's games, he said, walking away through the trees, until he was gone. 1 year later, I stood in the hunting lodge kitchen, staring out of the large windows, unable to believe that so much had happened in a year, and how quickly time had passed, and yet my life had changed exponentially. I barely recognised it any more. The only way I can describe it is being an actress who stars in a very sorry, forlorn part, where everything in her life spirals out of control, and one day the producer gives her a brand new script. She's now playing a new character whose life is pretty close to perfect, and not falling precariously apart like a laddered stocking. In truth, I felt like a whole new person in my own life, the old me that had been in a dark place for so long, longer than I cared to remember, had undergone a miraculous metamorphosis. I couldn't believe that I was no longer Freya Frost, but was now Freya Crosscrow. I couldn't remember a time when I felt more happy and contented with my life. The bird with a broken wing could finally fly, but it was another bird with a broken wing, Tina Crosscrow herself, who had given me the quintessential opportunity to find myself again, and to find my wings. In me she had recognised a kindred spirit, who needed a helping hand, but she had given me so much more than just a helping hand. It was through her incredible kindness that I met her brother Zack, and we had serendipitously fallen in love. So from beyond the grave she had played a Cupid in our lives, and I had been fortunate to meet my sister-in-law, even if our encounter was so brief. It did make me wonder if our paths are already written for us in invisible ink that finally becomes permanent. I was forced to conclude that maybe some things are just meant to be. Who would have believed that my chance fleeting encounter with a random stranger outside a bar would lead not only to my inheriting a cottage, but meeting a man who would ultimately become my husband? Ostensibly my parents in Canada were naturally over the moon that their daughter had finally tied the knot. I believe my withered mother, who felt like a seal tossed around by the waves all the time, was finally able to sleep at night, as her wayward daughter had found some stability in her life, and that brought her a measure of great peace. My sister Rainey was naturally thrilled that I was happily settled in my new life, but I think her husband Thornton could not comprehend what Zack Crosscrow, who was a skilled engineer, would want to have to do with a shop girl like myself, who had sold bras for a living.
That man could never take me seriously. He thought, and still thinks, I'm made of fluff, like candy floss you find at the fair. I even overheard him saying to my sister at our wedding reception, "Zack is a very clever man, who could have any girl he wants. What could he possibly have in common with a shop girl?" At least my sister nudged him and said, "Careful, that's my sister you're talking about." I guess that's the unfortunate way that Thornton will always perceive me, for his fixed view of the world will never be changed. But I don't care what he thinks about me, as his view of me doesn't matter a jot. I think from the moment I met Zack Crosscrow, I could feel there was a spark between us, but I was determined to put it out from the very start. It seemed wrong to be interested in Tina Crosscrow's brother. I guess you could say it was the scandalous course of events instigated by the duplicity of Sheila Partridge that flung both me and Zack together, as we pondered how anyone could be so vindictive and spiteful. So we hatched a plan of our very own. Sheila Partridge must sell the hunting lodge at a good price to us, or we would go to the police with all our evidence about how she conspired to defraud us. And to my amazement, both husband and son were willing to testify against her on our behalf. I'll never forget the look on Sheila's face when she realized the cat had finally come out of the bag, and that her clandestine, guileful deeds were now nakedly exposed. "I can't think what on earth you're talking about, Freya. You're talking absolute nonsense," she said, looking at me with a befuddled expression on her face that I didn't buy for a second. "I told you, did I not, that your cottage is haunted? Those strange things you're talking about have happened to you as a result of the haunting. They have absolutely nothing to do with me. I did not want to mention this to you, but when Tina Crosscrow was alive, she would tell me about these idiosyncratic occurrences in the cottage. She knew the place was haunted and was terribly frightened by the bizarre events." "I'll say one thing for you, Sheila," said Zack. "You're an excellent, very convincing liar. But we don't buy a word you're saying," he said, growling at her contemptuously. "The cottage was never ever haunted. You know that, I know that, and Tina knew that. If she'd thought as much, she would almost certainly have confided in me. She never liked you very much, Sheila, never trusted you. You're the last person she would have confided in. You and I well know that Sweet Pea Cottage was never ever haunted, but you wanted to make it appear that way, to suit your own ends." "Mrs. Partridge, we know all about your duplicitous plans, and you've certainly got some explaining to do. I caught your son Monty in the act of trashing my cottage, and he told me everything about your intention of buying our cottages from me and Zack at a steal. Your gluttonous plans were to sell this land to some developer who'd give you a huge price for this property, so you could buy yourself a dream place in the Hamptons, a house not very far from where Gwyneth Paltrow lives, am I right? That's what you wanted for yourself. I bet you were hoping that you and Gwyneth Paltrow could become bosom buddies and hang out together. You didn't care about how low you had to stoop to get what you wanted. You were ruthlessly aggressive in your attempts to scare me out of my cottage. There's something very sick about you, Mrs. Partridge. What you did was absolutely deplorable. You got your own son to put pig's blood all over my kitchen wall, and to write 'Get out' in blood, and to leave blood spatter all over my kitchen floor, and birds' feathers and body parts all over the place. My cottage looked like a macabre crime scene. You got a key for my cottage made for you, so that you could get your son to access my cottage, to play games with the electrics, bang on the door in the middle of the night, scare the bejesus out of me. Your son didn't want to do any of these things, but he's so scared of you, Mrs. Partridge, that he did it on your behalf. It's disgusting you made him do all this stuff." This time it was Angus Partridge, who was absolutely furious. He regarded his wife through narrowed eyes. "You got our son, Monty, to put pig's blood all over the walls of Freya's cottage. How sick are you, Sheila? I'm completely outraged. I've had enough of your vindictive games. I want nothing more to do with you, woman," he glowered. "You seriously need help. I never thought you were capable of stooping this low. I always knew you were a treacherous woman.
But this time you've gone too far. I want a divorce as soon as possible," he said. "Now that you know what your husband wants from you, Mrs. Partridge, I will tell you what we want," said Zack, taking my hand in his. "Me and Freya want you to sell the hunting lodge to us at a decent price, or we will go to the police ourselves and inform them about your intentional plan to defraud us on the cottages. Furthermore, I'm sure they'll be interested to hear about your insidious macabre stunts you pulled on Freya, your trespassing on her property. Imagine what it would do to your reputation if all this stuff about you got out." We could see that Sheila was defeated. She was like a deer caught in headlights. "Very well, I will sell you the lodge at a good price, as long as I have your word that you will not inform the police or any of the locals about this. I have my reputation at the agency to consider. As for a divorce," she said, looking at Angus in disgust, "you are welcome to one, Angus. Do you really think I was going to share a place in the Hamptons with you? Of course not. No, I intended to spit you out with the bath-water. I have never had any respect for you, my darling," she said callously, with no injection of remorse in her tone. "You were always so pathetic. You let me walk all over you because you have no backbone. You're completely spineless. You honestly expected me to respect you for that. And you have the audacity to call yourself a man. What a joke," she said snidely. "As for you, Monty, you're a chip off the old block, aren't you? Not only have I got a pathetic husband, but a pathetic son as well. Two birds of a feather you both are. And I'm very happy to finally see the back of you both. I hope to never see you again. Don't you worry, you can have your divorce. I intended to let you go anyway. Good riddance to bad rubbish as far as I'm concerned." "Now that you've said your piece, Sheila, I'd like you to leave this premises," said Zack, "or I shall call the police myself. Angus and Monty can stay here at the lodge as long as they like, until it's finally been sold to us," he said, putting his arm around me tenderly. "Me and Freya have decided to get married, so we want to live here at the lodge." "But you barely know each other," said Sheila, looking horrified. "That girl over there is probably marrying you to get her hands on this place. You can't trust a woman like her. I mean, she managed to get your sister to give her cottage, for goodness sake. She's a very treacherous girl, I can bet you that." "Sometimes you just know when it's right," said Zack, kissing me tenderly on the cheek. "And for the record, Sheila, we're not all wired like you are." We watched with a measure of satisfaction, Sheila being escorted off our property. We never did see her again. She sold the hunting lodge to us as she promised. She also sold her agency and moved out of town forthwith, as she was probably terrified that word would get out about her insane behaviour, but it never did, for we kept stum. The money from Sheila's divorce was divided between both her and her husband. I know she never got that house in the Hamptons that she wished for. Angus and Monty bought the White Swan from us. These days they have almost reinvented themselves. They now work for us full-time, helping around our property, as we have transformed the hunting lodge back to a thriving business, and we can have over 15 guests staying at the lodge at one time, in both summer and winter. The lodge is also used for other outdoor pursuits, like horse riding and fishing, so Angus and Monty do their part in making our guests feel warmly welcome. When I told Zack about the Bigfoot I had encountered, he was incredulous. Monty affirmed that when he tried to escape from Sweet Pea Cottage, from doing his mother's bidding with the pig's blood and dead crow, a huge Bigfoot had grabbed him by the scruff of the collar. "I've never been so terrified in my whole life. The thing was enormous, and it was furious with me. I thought it was going to kill me. I really did. Then I realized it was being protective towards Freya. Come to think of it, every time I'd go to Sweet Pea Cottage to pull a stunt, one thing or another, like messing with the electrics or something, I could swear I was being followed to the cottage, but nothing was ever there. I was really spooked. Now I know all the time that Bigfoot was watching me. He wanted to protect Freya. He knew I was up to no good." "It's funny you should say that," said Zack. "Tina used to confide in me that she always felt incredibly safe because a large male Bigfoot was watching over her cottage and keeping her safe. I thought it was all in her imagination, but I called her bluff. She called him the Watcher. She said she could go to bed at night with all the lights switched off because the Watcher was out there taking care of her. She said the Watcher would walk around the cottage at night to ensure she was absolutely safe. She told me once she had met the Watcher in the woods, who told her he'd always watch over her. In truth, I thought it was in her head, but it must have been true." "It is true," I said. "He's been watching over me as well. He wanted me to know that no one would ever scare me again. I believe he's out there, watching over the premises, watching over us to keep us safe." So there you are. That's my story. Wow, isn't that an incredible story? I don't know what to say. As far as Mrs. Partridge is concerned, what an appalling woman. She'd stop at nothing to get that girl to leave the cottage. But isn't it incredible how Tina Crosscrow crossed Freya's path and how she ended up inheriting this incredible cottage and she ended up meeting the man of her dreams? What a romantic story. But also, what an awful woman Mrs. Partridge was.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.